The man didn't even look up from his ledger when he said it. Harlan Voss, the land agent who had promised Rosalie Whitmore a cook's position at Barrow Creek Ranch, sat behind his desk in the Laramie land office and told her the job was gone. Just like that. No apology, no explanation worth anything. He flicked his wrist toward the door the way a man shoos a fly and said, "We don't need a woman your size hauling around a ranch kitchen. Wouldn't last a week anyway." Rosalie had sold her mother's sewing machine to afford the stage ticket. She had traveled 9 days to get here. He was already writing in his ledger before she finished standing up. If you've ever been dismissed before you even got the chance to try, stay with us. This is Rosalie's story, and it goes somewhere nobody expected. If this is your first time here, subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Wyoming, 1883, and meet the woman 6 men would one day chase across town just to bring home. The stagecoach dropped Rosalie Whitmore at the edge of Barrow Creek just after noon on a Wednesday in the late September, and the first thing she noticed was the wind. It came off the high plains without warning or apology, cutting straight through her wool coat and finding the spaces between her buttons like it had been looking for them all morning. She pulled the coat tighter across her chest. Not easy, given that the coat had been bought for a slimmer version of herself 10 years ago. And watched the coach disappear back down the road with something close to panic rising in her throat. She had $11. She had a trunk that weighed nearly as much as she did, stuffed with cooking tools, 3 changes of clothes, her mother's recipe book wrapped in oilcloth, and a letter from Harlan Voss confirming her position as head cook at Barrow Creek Ranch starting October 1st. She also had, as of 40 minutes ago, the knowledge that none of that mattered anymore. The Laramie land office had been her first stop off the stage. She'd wanted to confirm the travel reimbursement Voss had promised. Just a formality, she'd thought, smiling at the woman behind the front counter, already rehearsing the introduction she planned to give the ranch owner. The woman had looked up at her with an expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite confusion, but was somewhere uncomfortable between the two. "Mr. Voss isn't in today," the woman said. "When will he be back?" A pause that lasted too long. "He's been transferred to Denver." Rosalie stood there a moment. "The position he arranged for me, I wouldn't know anything about that, ma'am." She had pushed through the door anyway and found a junior clerk who confirmed what she already suspected. The cook's position at Barrow Creek Ranch had been arranged by Voss as a personal favor to someone, but Voss was gone. The favor had apparently dissolved with him, and the ranch had suffered a kitchen fire 3 weeks prior that had burned the original cookhouse to the ground. Whether they still needed a cook at all was, according to the clerk, unclear. Unclear. 9 days on a stagecoach, her mother's sewing machine, $11, unclear. So now she stood in the September wind at the edge of a town she'd never been to, with a trunk she could barely move and a letter that meant nothing, trying to remember what her mother had told her about the moments when everything falls apart at once. Her mother had been a practical woman who didn't believe in wasting tears on things that couldn't be undone. Figure out the next step, she used to say. Just the one step, not the whole road. Rosalie looked around Barrow Creek. It was small, maybe 300 people if you counted everyone within 5 miles. A main street with a general store, a livery, a hotel that looked like it had been built in a hurry and resented every moment of its existence, and a barbershop with a faded red and white pole out front. A few women moved along the boardwalk. A dog was asleep in the middle of the road, and nobody seemed bothered by it. She needed to find Barrow Creek Ranch, not because she expected anything from it now, but because it was the only name she knew in this entire territory, and the trunk wasn't going to drag itself anywhere. She asked at the general store. The man behind the counter, broad-shouldered, suspicious in the way of men who've been asked for directions too many times by people who then never buy anything, pointed her west. "'Bout 2 miles, he said. "'Can't miss the gate. Has a iron B on it. Is there a wagon going that direction?' He looked at her, then at the trunk beside her, then back at her. "'Not today.' She dragged the trunk 2 miles in the September wind. It took her an hour and 40 minutes. She stopped 4 times. Her hands were raw by the time the iron gate came into view. The letter B rusted at the curve and slightly crooked, like the whole thing had been hung by someone who'd given up caring halfway through. She set the trunk down on the road and sat on it and breathed. The ranch spread out behind the gate in the particular way of places that were once cared for and weren't anymore. The fences were standing, but needed mending. The barn roof had a new patch of pine boards that didn't match the weathered gray of the rest. There was a cookhouse-shaped absence near the main house, scorched earth and a few blackened posts. That must have been what the fire left behind. The house itself was 2 stories, solid enough, but the porch railing on the left side had come loose from its post and nobody had bothered to nail it back. Rosalie sat on her trunk and looked at all of it. Then a small face appeared at the gate. The girl was maybe 7, with dark braids that had been done carefully some time ago and had mostly given up since. She wore a dress that was clean but slightly too short, and she was looking at Rosalie with the unselfconscious directness that only small children manage without being rude about it. "Are you lost?" the girl asked. "I don't think so," Rosalie said. "Is this the Barrow Ranch?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then I'm in the right place. I'm not sure yet if that's good news." She said it mostly to herself, but the girl tilted her head like she'd caught the meaning underneath. "I'm Lillian," the girl said. "Rosalie Whitmore." She held out her hand over the gate and Lillian shook it with the gravity of someone much older. "That trunk looks heavy." "It is. Are you going to stay?" Rosalie looked past her at the house, at the scorched earth, at the sagging porch railing. "I haven't decided yet." Lillian considered this. Then she unlatched the gate and held it open. "Come on, Pa's out back." She found Caleb Barrow behind the barn, repairing a section of fence that had given out sometime in the last few days. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work hard and don't eat enough, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of hands that showed every year of outdoor work. He didn't hear her coming until she was close enough that startling him seemed unkind, so she spoke before he turned around. "Mr. Barrow, my name is Rosalie Whitmore. I have a letter from Harlan Voss saying I'm to be your cook." He turned. She had spent enough of her life watching men see her body before they saw her face to recognize the moment when it happened. It wasn't malicious in Caleb Barrow's case, more reflexive, the kind of assessment people do before they realize they're doing it. But she stood straight and didn't look away. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly. "The letter." She held it out. He took it, read it. His expression went through several things in the course of 30 seconds. She watched him get to the part about the salary. $8 a month, which was low, but she'd negotiated the travel reimbursement to make up the difference. And something shifted in his jaw. He folded the letter and held it back out to her. "I can't honor this," he said. "I know about the fire," she said. "I'm not asking you to provide a cookhouse. I can work from your kitchen in the main house if there's one." "There is, but..." He stopped, ran a hand over the back of his neck. "Miss Whitmore, I'm going to be straight with you because you came a long way and you deserve the truth. I'm 3 payments behind on this property. I've got 6 ranch hands I can barely feed, a daughter who needs things I can't afford, and I buried my wife 14 months ago. Whatever Voss promised you, I'm not in a position to pay it." Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. "How bad is the kitchen?" she asked. He blinked. "What?" "The kitchen in the house. How bad is it?" It works. My wife kept it clean. I haven't done much with it since..." He stopped again. "It works." "What are your men eating?" Something crossed his face that was close to shame. "Salt pork mostly. Dried beans. Eli, the youngest, he's been doing what he can, but he's 17 and never cooked much before the fire." Rosalie reached down and picked up her trunk by the handle. It didn't move gracefully. Nothing involving that trunk did, but she got it a few inches off the ground and looked at Caleb Barrow with the kind of steadiness that comes from having already survived the worst of the day. "I'll look at the kitchen," she said. "We can talk salary after." He stared at her. "Why would you..." "Because I'm here," she said simply, "and I have nowhere else to be." The kitchen was in worse shape than he'd implied, which she'd expected. Not broken. Her mother's standard for disaster was structural, things that couldn't be fixed with cleaning and rearranging, but neglected in the particular way of spaces where grief had moved in and productivity had moved out. There were good pots, a solid iron stove that just needed the flue cleared, and a pantry with more in it than Caleb seemed to realize. She found dried corn, a half barrel of flour that was still good, smoked bacon, dried apples, and enough salt and lard to work with. Lillian followed her through the whole assessment, quiet and watchful. "You know what's in this pantry?" Rosalie asked her. "Some of it," Lillian said. "Mrs. Hendricks from town brought things after Mama died. Some of it's been here a long time." Rosalie opened a tin and sniffed. "This cornmeal's still good." She put it on the counter. "Your father said you haven't had a real cook since the fire?" "Eli tries," Lillian said carefully, in the tone of someone being very generous. "I'm sure he does." She looked around the kitchen again, measuring it against what she knew how to do. "Go tell your father I'll make supper tonight. He and I can talk about arrangements after." Lillian went without asking any other questions, which Rosalie appreciated. She had a fire in the stove inside 20 minutes. The flue had been the problem. Something had built a partial nest in it, starlings maybe, and the smoke had been backing up and discouraging anyone from using the stove regularly. She found a stick in the yard, cleared it out, and the draft came through clean. She had cornbread in the Dutch oven and a proper bean soup on the burner by 3 in the afternoon, and she was rendering salt pork for the top when she heard boots on the porch and voices that stopped when they reached the door. She turned around. 6 men filled the doorway, or tried to. They ranged in age from about 17 to somewhere in the mid-40s, and they were all looking at her with the combined expression of people who have been told something they don't know whether to believe. "You the new cook?" the oldest one asked. He was stocky, with a gray-streaked beard and the careful eyes of someone who'd been disappointed enough times to wait before forming an opinion. "Rosalie Whitmore," she said. "Supper's at 6. Wash your hands before you come to the table." A beat of silence. "Yes, ma'am," said the youngest one. A boy, really, with a sunburned nose and the relieved expression of someone who had been quietly dreading another meal of his own making. That would be Eli Carter. She catalogued it. The stocky older one introduced himself as Henry Cole, then pointed around at the others. Wyatt Dawson, who was tall and narrow and hadn't said a word yet. Marcus Bell, with arms like small trees and a surprisingly gentle face. Samuel Reed, who was already eyeing the soup pot with undisguised hope. Mateo Vargas, who tipped his hat and said nothing. And Eli, who looked at the cornbread cooling on the rack like it was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in weeks. 6 o'clock, she said again, and turned back to the stove. They left. Supper that night changed something. She could feel it in the room. The way the men sat straighter after the first few bites, the way conversation came easier, the way even Wyatt Dawson, who appeared to operate on a strict policy of minimal words, said, "This is good," when she brought a second round of cornbread. Caleb sat at the head of the table and watched his ranch hands eat and didn't say much. Lillian sat beside Rosalie without being asked and passed the butter when people needed it, like she'd assigned herself the role of assistant and didn't intend to give it up. After supper, when the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and Lillian was in bed, Caleb came to the kitchen doorway while Rosalie was washing up. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. I still can't pay you. Not what Voss promised." She set a pot on the drying rack and picked up the next one. "What can you pay?" He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing right now. I want to be honest about that. If we make the spring payment and I can get the herd to market, I could pay you back wages. But that's a long way off and I can't promise it." "What would I have instead of wages?" "Room and board, the small room at the top of the stairs. It was the housekeeper's room before. Meals. And He stopped, looking like a man who knows the offer he's making isn't fair and is making it anyway because he has nothing else. "I'd make it right when I could. That's all I can promise." Rosalie dried her hands on the kitchen cloth. She thought about the $11 in her coat pocket. She thought about the hotel in town, which had a sign in the window that said, "Help Wanted," and which would probably take her on as a kitchen girl at $5 a month and never think twice about her. She thought about Lillian passing the butter. "I'll need full access to the pantry and the authority to manage it," she said. "No one second-guessing my decisions about what we cook or what we buy." Caleb blinked. "All right. And I'll keep my own records of what I'm owed. That's fair. And if the situation changes, if it becomes clear the ranch isn't going to survive, I need enough notice to find another position. A month." "A month," he said. "Yes." She looked at him across the kitchen, this tired man with gray at his temples and a ranch falling apart around him. And she thought about the fact that she had, as of this moment, $11 and a trunk full of cooking tools and no viable alternative. "All right then," she said. "I'll start properly tomorrow." She stayed. The first morning she was up before anyone else, which was how she preferred it. The kitchen before dawn had a particular quality of possibility to it. Everything still organized from the night before, the stove cold but ready, the day not yet complicated by the things that would complicate it. She had the fire going and the first pot of coffee on before she heard the bunkhouse door open. Henry Cole was first. As it turned out, he always was. He came to the kitchen door before heading to the barn, and she handed him a tin cup without a word. He looked at it, then at her. "You always up this early?" "Yes." He nodded, drank, handed the cup back. "My wife was like that," he said, and walked on to the barn. It was the most personal thing he said to her for the next 3 weeks. The first week was about survival, hers and the ranch's. She learned the rhythms of the place faster than she'd expected, partly because Lillian was an excellent informant. The girl knew everything about the ranch that a 7-year-old could know, which turned out to be considerable. She knew which men liked their coffee strong and which couldn't tolerate it bitter. She knew that Wyatt Dawson had a bad tooth on the left side and couldn't chew hard things without pain, which explained why he ate so slowly and never complained about it. She knew that her father had been skipping breakfast entirely for the past several months, taking only coffee before going out, and that he'd lost enough weight that his belt had a new notch in it. Rosalie filed all of this away. By the end of the first week, she had the breakfast situation organized. Different needs accommodated without fuss, without anyone having to ask. Wyatt's salt pork was cut fine. Caleb's plate had more on it than he'd requested. Eli's coffee was exactly as sweet as he quietly preferred it without ever having said so aloud. None of them noticed that she'd noticed. That was fine. Toward the end of the first week, she found the supply problem. She'd been going through the pantry carefully, inventorying what was there and what the rate of consumption was going to be for 7 men, a child, and herself through the winter. The numbers weren't adding up. Not because there wasn't enough in the pantry, there was, barely, but because she was finding evidence of serious mismanagement that had nothing to do with the fire. Sacks of grain with insect damage that could have been caught earlier. Preserved vegetables that had been improperly sealed, some of which had already turned. A barrel of apples half rotted because nobody had checked them or culled the bad ones before they spread to the rest. Salt that had been stored in a damp corner and had partially clumped beyond usefulness. She put together the numbers and stood in the pantry doorway looking at what they meant. Someone would have to tell Caleb. She found him in the barn that afternoon, replacing a broken halter. She stood at the door and waited until he looked up, and then she said, "I need to show you something." He listened without interrupting while she laid it out. The waste she'd found, the current inventory, what they had and what they'd need by March if the winter ran long, the numbers she'd calculated for purchasing to fill the gaps before prices went up in November. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How much is all that going to cost?" he asked. $60, roughly, if I do it right and find good prices in town. He sat down on a hay bale. $60 might as well have been $600 from his expression. "I don't have $60 right now." "You'll have less food than you need by January if we don't do something now." "I know. If you tell me what you can manage, I can prioritize." He looked up at her. "You worked this all out yourself. It's what you hired me to do." "I didn't hire you," he said. "I can't even do that properly." The bitterness in it wasn't aimed at her. She understood that. She sat down on the hay bale across from him because sometimes a person needed someone to sit down with them before they could think clearly. "How much did the kitchen fire cost you?" she asked. "Between the equipment and the structure, close to $400. I borrowed some of it from the bank. That's part of what I owe them." "How much are you behind on the property payment?" He looked at her sideways. I'm not prying. I'm trying to understand what's possible." He rubbed the back of his neck. $250, maybe $300 by December if I don't do something. "And your herd?" "I've got 40 head I can take to market in spring. That should cover it, if prices don't drop." He said if the way people said it when they meant, and they probably will. Rosalie thought for a moment. "Give me $20 for supplies. I'll make it work." He stared at her. $20. "I know what I'm doing in a pantry. Give me 20 and let me manage it, and I'll get you to spring without anyone going hungry." She paused. "You'll owe me the rest later. You're adding to what I already owe you." "Yes," she said. "I'm keeping track." Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly. More like the expression of a man who has been alone with a problem for so long that having someone sit down across from him and take it seriously feels like something he has to blink against. $20, he said. $20. She confirmed. The second week was harder than the first, though not in any way she could have predicted going in. Wyatt Dawson was the first one to say something she had to decide whether to respond to. She was carrying a pot of water in from the pump. It was heavy, as it always was, and it took 2 hands, and he was coming from the barn and passed her on the path. He didn't offer to take it from her. What he said, low and to nobody in particular, was, "Least she's built for hauling." She kept walking. She set the pot on the kitchen counter. She stood with her hands on the counter for a moment. She decided not to say anything. Not because she didn't have anything to say. She had a considerable amount to say. But she was 8 days into a position at a ranch where she wasn't being paid, where she was relying on the goodwill of 6 men she didn't know, and picking a fight with one of them in the second week over a comment he thought she hadn't heard clearly wasn't going to serve her. She went back to the pump for the second pot. Marcus Bell was the one who walked by this time, coming from the other direction, and he took the second pot from her without being asked and carried it to the kitchen door. He didn't say anything either. He just set it down and walked on. She didn't know if he'd heard what Wyatt said or was just being decent. She didn't ask. By the end of week 2, she had the supply situation partially corrected and had started a plan for the garden she'd noticed behind the house. It was overgrown, but the soil was good, and there were the remnants of a well-organized kitchen garden that must have been Caleb's wife's work. Rosalie had started clearing it in the late afternoons after supper was cleaned up and before dark, because there was maybe 3 weeks left before hard frost, and she wanted to see what could still be salvaged. Lillian started helping. Not asked. She just appeared one afternoon with a pair of 2 large gloves and started pulling weeds alongside Rosalie without asking what she was supposed to do. She seemed to understand what Rosalie was looking for instinctively, which made sense for a girl who'd probably spent considerable time in this garden with her mother. There were carrots here, Lillian said, pointing at a section of cleared row, and turnips. Mama called this the root section. Good. Root vegetables store well. Rosalie kept working. Did she teach you to cook? Some. A pause. She got sick before I could learn much. Rosalie didn't push. She just said, "You can learn in the kitchen this winter if you want." Lillian was quiet for a moment, pulling at a stubborn weed. Pa says Mama was a good cook. I believe him. She made a cake every Sunday. What kind? Yellow cake. With molasses frosting. Another pause. I don't remember exactly what it tasted like. I remember I liked it. Rosalie sat back on her heels, 7 years old and already learning that memory was imperfect, that the things you wanted to hold on to most were often the ones that blurred first. She thought about what to say and decided on the truth. That happens, she said. You remember that you loved it even when the details go. That's the part that matters. Lillian nodded slowly, like she was filing it away. They worked until the light got too thin to see the weeds from the soil, and then they went inside and Rosalie taught her how to wash vegetables properly before she went up to bed. Week 3 arrived with the first serious cold, and with it, the problem of Eli Carter. She'd been watching him since the first day, the way she watched everyone she cooked for, trying to understand the shape of each person's hunger and what it meant. Eli was the youngest, 17 she'd confirmed, and he had a quality of self-effacement that, in someone his age, usually indicated something behind it. Not shyness, exactly. More like long practice at making himself smaller. She started setting aside an extra portion for him. Not conspicuously. She just made sure his plate had a bit more than the others when she served, and she never said anything about it. He didn't say anything either, for the first week and a half. Then one morning, she found him in the kitchen at 5 a.m, earlier than anyone else, sitting at the table with a cup of cold water because he hadn't wanted to start the stove without asking. "Stove's yours," she said, reaching past him to get the fire going. "You don't have to ask." I didn't want to be in the way. She looked at him. "How long have you been on this ranch?" 8 months. "And before that?" He looked at the table. Different places. She didn't ask more than that. She made the fire and put the coffee on and sliced bread and put it on the rack near the heat. "You were the one cooking before I came," she said. "Trying to." It's hard to cook for a lot of people when you don't have the training. He shrugged one shoulder. They didn't complain. "You went hungry so they'd have enough." He looked up sharply. "I can count portions," she said simply. "I could see from the first night that you'd been shorting yourself." He said nothing. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. "There's enough," she said. "As long as I'm managing this kitchen, there's enough for everyone, including you. Don't short yourself." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am," in the voice of someone who had been told not to expect much for long enough that being told differently required some adjustment. That was the end of week 3. And then, at the start of week 4, Rosalie heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. She had gone to the barn to get the extra preserving jars she'd noticed stored on a high shelf when she'd first arrived. She needed them for the last of the fall preserving, and she'd been waiting for a moment when the barn was empty. She went in the side door, which she never used, and she was halfway to the shelf when she heard voices from the far side of the barn where the tack room was. Caleb's voice, and Henry Cole's. "Can't keep going like this," Henry was saying. "The men are talking." About what? About whether this place is worth staying for. Wyatt's already had a better offer from the Chambers operation 2 valleys over. He's thinking about it. A pause. Wyatt doesn't go anywhere in November. Not yet, but if things don't change. Henry's voice dropped half a step. "Caleb, the bank letter that came yesterday. I saw it on the table. They've moved the deadline up. Silence. How much time? Henry asked. End of February. Caleb's voice was flat. They want the full payment by end of February or they start proceedings. That's 3 months. I know what 3 months is, Henry. Another pause. Rosalie stood very still between two stalls, her arms full of glass jars, feeling like she was standing at the edge of something that was about to fall. What about the woman? Henry asked. What about her? She's working herself to bones for nothing. You haven't paid her a cent. If this ranch goes under... I know. She doesn't know. Or if she does, she hasn't said anything. She's keeping her own records, Caleb said. She told me that at the start. She knows what she's owed. And what happens to that if the bank takes the property? No answer. Rosalie carefully, silently, retreated back to the side door with her jars. She stood in the cold outside the barn and breathed and looked at the sky, which was the particular white-gray of a Wyoming sky in October, heavy with the possibility of things to come. She went back to the kitchen. She made supper. She didn't say anything to anyone about what she'd heard, but that night, after the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with her own notebook, the one she'd been using to keep the supply records and the wage ledger she maintained in the back, and she looked at what she'd written there. 4 weeks. $32 owed at the salary she and Caleb had discussed, $60 in supplies she'd managed on 20. She had kept the ranch fed for 4 weeks on $20 and her own labor, and the ranch might not exist by spring. She put the notebook away. She went to bed. She lay in the small upstairs room that had been the housekeeper's room, listening to the wind in the eaves and the distant sound of Lillian breathing in her sleep down the hall. She thought about the hotel in town, the help wanted sign, $5 a month and no uncertainty. She thought about Eli's face when she told him there was enough. She thought about Lillian saying, I remember I liked it, about a cake she could no longer quite taste in her memory. She didn't sleep for a long time. But when she did, she was still in the house. She was still there. The cold that arrived in the 5th week was not the gradual cold of a season changing its mind slowly. It came down from the north overnight, hard and without apology, and when Rosalie opened the kitchen door before dawn, she found the pump handle frozen solid and a thin skin of ice across the water barrel she kept near the porch steps. She went back inside, heated a pot of water on the stove, carried it out, and poured it over the pump until the handle moved. Then she started breakfast. This was the part nobody saw, not the cooking itself. The men filed in for that. They noticed what was on their plates and whether the coffee was hot. But the hour before it, the work of getting a kitchen functional in November on the Wyoming plain, when the temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight and the firewood supply was going to need addressing before the end of the week. She'd been watching the woodpile since the 2nd week. It was low. Not dangerously low yet, but low enough that someone needed to say something to Caleb before it became a problem he'd have to solve in an emergency rather than in advance. She mentioned it to him at breakfast, quietly, while he was still on his first cup of coffee and the men were eating. The woodpile needs attention before the cold settles in properly. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. I'll put Wyatt and Marcus on it today. Good. That was the whole conversation. He went back to his coffee. She went back to the stove, and somehow in the 5 weeks since she'd walked through the gate dragging her trunk, that had become the shape of their working arrangement. Brief, practical, neither of them wasting words on things the other one already understood. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She was thinking about it later that morning when Lillian appeared at the kitchen door wearing her coat buttoned wrong and one braid half undone, a condition that Rosalie had come to understand was normal for Lillian in the mornings and not an indication of anything being wrong. Can I help today? Lillian asked. Depends what you mean by help. Rosalie was working through a batch of dried apples, sorting the ones that had started to go from the ones still good. If you mean standing next to me and handing me things, yes. If you mean telling me what to do, no. Lillian climbed onto the stool she'd claimed as hers in the 3rd week and picked up an apple slice. How do you know which ones are bad? Color first, smell second, feel third. Rosalie demonstrated. This one, see how it's darker at the edge and it has a soft spot there. That one goes. Lillian examined the reject pile seriously. Can I try? She sorted apple slices alongside Rosalie for the better part of an hour, with a focus that was almost unnerving in a 7-year-old. She was wrong about a third of them at first and gradually got better, and she didn't complain when Rosalie overturned her decisions, just looked at the apple slice more carefully and tried to see what she'd missed. Mama grew these, Lillian said eventually. Rosalie kept sorting. The apple tree out past the garden? She planted it before I was born. Pa said she wanted enough apples every year to put some up and still have fresh ones through October. A pause. We haven't made apple butter since she died. We could do that. Lillian looked up quickly. Really? We have enough apples. It's a good thing to put up for winter. Rosalie set the sorted pile to one side. I'll need your help if we do it. It takes a long time and you have to keep stirring. I can do that. I know you can. The apple butter was made 2 days later on a Saturday when the wind died down enough to make the kitchen warm without effort. It took most of the day, and Lillian stirred until her arm got tired and then switched arms and kept going, and by the time the jars were sealed and cooling on the rack and the kitchen smelled like something that had nothing to do with hardship or debt or frozen pump handles, Caleb Barrow appeared in the doorway. He stood there, looking at the jars and at his daughter sitting on her stool with both arms tired and apple butter on her chin, and his face did something complicated that Rosalie didn't look at directly. She helped all day, Rosalie said, answering the question he hadn't asked yet. I can see that. His voice was careful. Lillian held up her arms to show the stains. I stirred the whole time. I believe you. He came in and sat down at the table. Not for a meal, just sat, which was something he'd never done before in the kitchen outside of mealtimes. Rosalie put a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked and went back to the cleanup. He sat there for a while, watching Lillian explain the process of apple butter to him in the authoritative tone of someone who learned something 6 hours ago and is already an expert. He didn't say much. He drank his coffee. Something in his shoulders was less rigid than usual. When Lillian finally ran out of steam and disappeared upstairs, he said, She hasn't talked about her mother's apple tree in a long time. Rosalie kept washing jars. She talked about it the other day when we were sorting. What did she say? That your wife planted it before Lillian was born. That she wanted enough apples to put some up and still have fresh ones through October. She set a clean jar on the rack. She knew that detail. It mattered to her. He was quiet. Kids hold on to things differently than adults do, Rosalie said. They don't always talk about them directly, but they're holding them. She doesn't talk about her mother much at all. He stopped. I thought maybe she was too young to remember much. She remembers more than she can say. Rosalie dried her hands. She just needs someone to give her an entry point sometimes. An apple butter day is an entry point. He looked at her, not the way he had on the first day, that reflexive assessment she'd learned to wait out. Something different, like a man looking at a person and trying to understand how they came to know what they know. Thank you, he said. It's what I'm here for, she said, which was true, and also, she recognized privately, only partly what she meant. Week 6 brought the first real complication with the men. It started with Wyatt Dawson, as she'd half expected it would. Wyatt had been the one consistent friction point, not constant or dramatic, but persistent, like a stone in a boot that was manageable most days and then on certain days wasn't. He did his work, he wasn't cruel, but he had a way of making her feel that her presence was something he was tolerating rather than accepting, and he made sure she knew he was tolerating it. The issue was the kitchen supplies. She had established from the beginning that the pantry was her domain, her responsibility, and her authority. Caleb had agreed to this and told the men, but Wyatt had a habit of going into the pantry before supper when he thought nobody was there and taking things. Not stealing exactly. He wasn't putting anything in his pocket, but eating from what she'd stored. A handful of dried fruit here, a piece of cornbread from what she'd put up for tomorrow's breakfast there. Small amounts. But they were amounts she'd calculated, and his additions to the margin were throwing off her careful running of the supplies. She had said nothing for 2 weeks, watching to be sure she knew what was happening before she addressed it. On the first Tuesday of week 6, she was in the pantry doing her weekly inventory when he came in behind her without knocking. There was no door, but there should have been acknowledgement, and reached past her for the dried apple jar. She put her hand on the jar before his reached it. He stopped. She turned around. They were close in the small space, which put her at a disadvantage in terms of room to stand her ground, but she'd spent enough of her life being crowded in small spaces to have learned not to step back automatically. I need to know, she said evenly, what you're taking and when, because I'm working with exact amounts and your additions are creating a problem I can't account for. He looked at her, his jaw tightened. It's just a handful of dried apples. Yes, and the handful of dried fruit on Thursday and the cornbread on Sunday morning, and the twice this week you've come in here before supper and taken something I'd set aside. She kept her voice calm because going sharp here would give him something to push against. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you it affects my numbers and I need to know so I can adjust. You're accounting for every piece of dried fruit? I'm accounting for everything. That's how I keep 16 people fed on what this ranch can afford right now. If you need something before supper, Come ask me. I'll get it for you." He stared at her for a long moment. She watched him decide between 2 or 3 responses and discard all of them. "Fine," he said finally, and left the pantry. She stood there a moment after he left, then went back to her inventory. Her hands were steady. She was careful about that. That evening, Henry Cole found her in the kitchen after supper cleanup and leaned against the doorframe with his coffee cup. "Wyatt give you trouble today?" he asked. "Nothing I couldn't handle. He's got a particular way about him. I've noticed." Henry drank his coffee. He had a comfortable way of taking up space. Henry did. Not aggressive, just solid. He was on a ranch in Montana before this one. Ran it for 3 years after the owner died. Thought he was going to inherit a stake in it. Owner's family came and sold it out from under him. Rosalie looked at him. "That's why he's here. That's why he's here. He's not a bad man. He just doesn't like feeling like somebody's managing his life for him." Henry paused. "Not that that's your problem to solve." "No," she agreed, "but it's useful to know." He nodded and set his cup on the counter. "You're good at this." "At cooking?" "At people," he said, and walked out. She thought about that for a while after he left. She wasn't sure she agreed. She was observant. That was different from being good at people. Being observant was a skill you developed when you spent your life in rooms where the balance could shift against you without warning. You learned to read the room because you had to. It wasn't a skill she'd ever been praised for before. The week after the Wyatt conversation, something unexpected happened with Samuel Reed. Samuel was the one she knew least, which was saying something, since she was still learning most of them. He was in his mid-30s, quiet in a different way than Wyatt. Wyatt's silence was deliberate, controlled. Samuel's was more like a man who had a lot going on inside and had never particularly found a channel for it. He did his work without complaint, ate what was put in front of him, said thank you in a way that sounded like he meant it, and otherwise occupied himself at the end of the day with a small notebook she'd noticed him writing in but never asked about. She noticed one evening that he'd barely touched his supper. She didn't say anything at the table, but when the others had gone out and Samuel was still sitting with his mostly full plate and his coffee going cold, she brought the coffee pot over and refreshed it without asking. He looked up. "You don't have to eat if you're not hungry," she said, "but if something's wrong with the food, I'd rather know." "Food's fine." He wrapped his hands around the fresh coffee. "It's not the food." She sat down across from him, which surprised him. She could see it. She didn't usually sit at the table during cleanup time. "Something from home?" she asked. He looked at her. "How'd you know?" "You've been checking the mail the last 3 days. You got something today, and then you sat differently all through supper." He was quiet for a moment, then, "My mother's not well. Back in Illinois." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "My sister wrote. She's been managing it alone, and I can tell from the letter she's running out of strength. Can you go?" "Not until spring. I can't leave in the middle of winter, and I can't leave Caleb short-handed right now." "Have you told Caleb?" He shook his head. It's my problem. That's not..." She stopped herself before saying what she'd been about to say, which was the kind of thing that sounded like advice when she hadn't been asked for it. "What does your mother need?" "Mostly someone there. She can still do for herself mostly. He stopped. "She shouldn't be alone." Rosalie nodded slowly. "Is there anyone else who could go? Another family member? A neighbor?" "My sister's the only one who's been there. There's a woman 2 farms over who helps sometimes." He was quiet. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because you're carrying it and supper's the only time you sit down," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face loosened slightly. She got up to continue the cleanup. "Write your sister back tonight," she said. "Tell her you can't come yet, but you're coming in spring and you mean it. People wait better when they know there's a date." He sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up his fork and started eating. She didn't say anything else about it. Week 7 was the week Marcus Bell took a fence post to the forearm. It was a freak thing. A section of post gave way when it shouldn't have, and the end came around and caught him before he could step back. And he came in from the field cradling his right arm against his chest, white under his brown skin, not saying much. Rosalie had the ranch's medicine box, which was poorly stocked and had not been inventoried since Caleb's wife was alive. She sat Marcus down at the kitchen table and looked at the arm, which was swelling but not bent wrong. "I don't think it's broken," she said. "Me neither," he said through his teeth. "Can you move your fingers?" He moved them, slowly. "Yes." "Good." She wrapped it in cold cloths, the closest thing to ice available, and bound it firmly. You're not using this hand for at least 3 days. If the swelling doesn't go down by tomorrow evening, we need to get you to town and find a doctor. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. I said 3 days. She tied off the binding, and the medicine box is almost empty. What's in it has been here since before your time. I'll need Caleb to get proper supplies from town before the winter gets worse. Marcus looked at his wrapped arm. That's tighter than I expected. It needs to be. Where'd you learn that? My mother. She put the remaining cloths away. She had a household of 4 brothers, all of them convinced they were indestructible. She learned out of necessity. He tested the binding carefully. She was right about the tension. She usually was. He sat at the table for a while longer than he needed to, which told her the arm hurt more than he was saying. She made him a cup of strong tea, not coffee, which wouldn't help, and put it in front of him without comment. He drank it. Thank you, he said. 3 days, she repeated and went back to the stove. Caleb heard about the arm and came to find her that evening, which she'd expected. How bad? He asked. Not broken, I'm fairly certain, but he needs to rest it or he'll make it worse. And the medicine box needs restocking. I've already written out what you need. She handed him the list. Most of it's at the general store. He looked at the list, then at her. You've done this before. I've had to be the person who handles things when there wasn't a doctor available. She kept her voice neutral. It's a different thing than having training. I want to be clear about that. If that arm shows any sign of being worse tomorrow, someone needs to drive him to town. Understood. He folded the list. I'll go to town tomorrow for the supplies. She nodded. He didn't leave immediately. He stood in the kitchen doorway the way he'd been doing more often lately, not wanting a meal, not needing anything specific, just present. She'd noticed it and hadn't said anything about it. Rosalie, he said. She looked at him. I want you to know, he stopped, tried again. What you're doing here, it's more than cooking. I know, she said simply. I wanted to say it out loud. I heard you. He nodded, a little awkwardly, and went back down the porch steps into the evening. She watched him cross the yard toward the barn and thought that it took a certain kind of man to say something like that and mean it plainly, without wanting anything back for having said it. She thought about Wyatt's comment in week 2. Least she's built for hauling. She thought about Caleb's halting it's more than cooking. People were rarely one thing, in her experience. The difficulty was figuring out which parts of a person you were dealing with at any given moment. In week 8, Clara Whitfield introduced herself. Rosalie had been in town twice now for supplies, both times quick and purposeful, not the kind of visits that invited conversation. But on the second Tuesday of week 8, she was at the general store counter when a woman she hadn't seen before came in and went directly to stand beside her, which was close enough to be deliberate. You're the woman from the Barrow Ranch, the woman said. Not a question. Rosalie looked at her. She was somewhere in her 40s, thin and well-dressed by frontier standards, with the kind of self-possession that came from either money or from having built something and knowing it. Rosalie Whitmore, she said. Clara Whitfield. The woman extended her hand and shook firmly. I run the hotel. I've seen it. I've seen you too. Twice now in this store. Clara's eyes were quick, taking in details without embarrassment about doing it. You're managing the Barrow household. Cooking for it? Yes. And managing it, Clara said, with slight emphasis as if correcting a deliberate understatement. You're the one who figured out the pantry situation in the first month. Old Hanson at the store told me. Said a woman from Barrow came in and bought supplies like someone who actually knew what they were doing. She paused. First time in 2 years anyone from that ranch bought anything beyond salt and bacon. Rosalie finished her transaction with Hanson, counted her change, and turned back to Clara. What is it you wanted to say? Clara smiled. It was a real smile, not the performed kind. Directly. Good. She moved aside to let another customer pass. I have a position open at the hotel. Kitchen management. Not just cooking. Full management of supplies, staff, the dining room schedule. 3 women work in my kitchen now, and they're good, but they don't have a head for the bigger picture. I've been looking for someone who does. Rosalie looked at her. The wage is $12 a month, Clara said, and there's a room on the second floor, private, with its own window. You'd take meals with the staff. $12. Compared to the $32 she was owed for 8 weeks at $8, which might never materialize. Compared to the room at the top of the Barrow stairs and the ledger she kept in the back of her notebook. I'm in a position at the moment, Rosalie said. A position where you're being paid. The question landed flat and clean. Rosalie looked at her steadily. Clara met her eyes without flinching. I'm asking directly because someone in town told me the Barrow Ranch is 3 payments behind and has a woman working their kitchen for whatever arrangement you have. She said it without judgment, purely informational. I'm not saying that to embarrass you. I'm saying it because I know what it looks like when a capable woman is working somewhere for less than she's worth, and I've done it myself long enough to recognize it. Rosalie said nothing. You don't have to decide now, Clara said. The position's been open 3 months. I'd rather wait for the right person than fill it with the wrong one. She picked up her own goods from the counter. Come see the hotel when you have time. I'll show you the kitchen. She walked out. Rosalie stood at the store counter for a moment, her basket in her hand, the December wind coming through the briefly open door. $12. Private room. And the knowledge, which she'd been carrying since the night she overheard Caleb and Henry in the barn, that the Barrow Ranch might not exist by spring. She walked back to the ranch. She made supper. She did not tell anyone about the conversation. But that evening, she opened her notebook to the ledger in the back and wrote the date, and under it wrote the number she was owed, which was now 2 months and 1 week of wages, plus the $40 in supply decisions she'd managed on 20, and she sat with it for a while. The numbers told a clear story. She had given this ranch 8 weeks of her best work and had not received a single dollar. Clara Whitfield was right that a woman who worked without pay had no protection if things went wrong. That was not a philosophical point. That was a practical one. She closed the notebook. Week 9 arrived with a problem nobody had anticipated and everyone should have. The root cellar. She'd been using it regularly since October for the stored vegetables, and she'd noticed a soft spot in the south wall for weeks, the kind of soft spot that said the drainage wasn't right and water was getting in somewhere it shouldn't. She'd mentioned it to Caleb in passing, and he'd said he'd look at it, and then the business of November became the business of December, and nobody looked at it. And the first hard freeze came, and the water that had been getting into the wall expanded and took out a section of shelving on the east side. She found it on a Monday morning when she went down to get turnips. 2 shelves down, jars broken, a full section of stored carrots and turnips ruined by the collapse. Everything on those shelves unsalvageable. She stood in the cold of the root cellar and surveyed it and did the math in her head. It was not catastrophic, but it was significant. They'd lost maybe a fifth of the winter vegetable stores. She went and found Caleb in the barn. The south wall of the root cellar gave, she said, 2 shelves down. We've lost roughly a fifth of the stored vegetables. He closed his eyes briefly. I meant to look at that. I know. We need to fix the wall now. I'll need 2 of the men for half a day, and then figure out what to replace and what to do without. She'd already been doing that calculation in her head on the walk from the root cellar. It changes our winter plan. I can adjust, but some of what I had planned for January and February will need to change. What do you need? The men first, and another $10 for supplies if I'm going to cover the gap, maybe 12. He looked at her. She could see him calculating what he had against what she was asking, which was the expression she recognized now, the particular arithmetic of a man who has too many numbers on one side of the ledger. I can get you 10, he said. 10's workable. Marcus and Eli spent the morning in the root cellar while Rosalie supervised the repair and recovery operation, pulling out what was salvageable and reorganizing what remained. Marcus did the wall repair with one good arm and one that was still healing, which she would have argued against, except that he'd positioned himself so he was using the good arm for the actual work and the other for balance, and she respected practical solutions. Eli worked alongside her in focused silence, handing her things, moving jars, doing exactly what she needed without her having to explain it twice. He was getting better at reading what was needed, she'd noticed, at following the logic of a task. You're good at this, she told him at one point. He looked surprised. Moving things around? Anticipating. You see what's needed and you do it before being asked. She handed him a jar. That's a skill. Don't underestimate it. He thought about that. My mother used to say I was slow. At what? He shrugged. Everything. The way she told it. People say things that fit their view of you. Doesn't make the view accurate. She handed him another jar. You're not slow. You're careful. There's a significant difference. He didn't say anything to that, but his pace shifted slightly, something in the deliberateness of his movement that was less like apology and more like intention. It was a small thing. She thought small things mattered more than people usually credited. Week 10 was when Rosalie let herself feel, for the first time since she'd arrived, something close to being in the right place. It surprised her, that feeling. She hadn't been expecting it. It happened on a Thursday evening after supper, when the snow was coming down steadily outside and the kitchen was warm and the men had pushed back from the table without rushing to leave, which they'd never done in the first weeks. They'd been eating and talking, actual conversation, not just information exchange. And Eli had said something that made Marcus laugh, which was still a rare enough sound that it registered. And Lillian had been sitting in her usual spot explaining to Samuel with great authority the correct way to peel an apple, which Rosalie had never actually taught her, but she'd watched it done enough times to have formed opinions. Caleb was at the end of the table with his coffee, watching his household in a way she hadn't seen him watch it before. Not the exhausted observation of a man counting his problems. Something quieter than that. He caught her eye across the table. She looked away first. She was doing the last of the supper cleanup when she heard him come into the kitchen. He stood for a moment without saying anything, and she finished what she was doing before she turned around. "You're thinking about leaving," he said. She looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "You get a look sometimes." He put his coffee cup on the counter. "Like you're calculating something." "I am always calculating something. I run a household. This is different." He wasn't accusing. He was stating something he'd observed. "Clara Whitfield talked to you." She didn't ask how he knew. "Yes." "She offer you something?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. He looked like a man who'd walked up to a conversation he'd been avoiding and had decided, finally, to stand in it. $12 a month, I'd guess. That's what she pays her people. Something like that. And a guaranteed wage. He put his hands on the back of a kitchen chair. "Rosalie, you know what the situation here is." "I do." "If the bank moves up the deadline again, and there's talk that they might, I can't guarantee—" "I know what you can and can't guarantee," she said, not unkindly. He was quiet. Outside, the snow kept coming. "Why are you still here?" he asked. It came out plainly, without any edges to it. A genuine question from a man who wasn't sure of the answer and thought she might be. She thought about Lillian and the apple butter. She thought about Eli saying she told me there was enough. She thought about the kitchen on Thursday evening with the snow outside and the men not rushing to leave. "I'm not sure that's a question I can answer right now," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. He picked up his coffee cup and went to bed. She finished the kitchen cleanup. She checked the stove damper. She turned down the lamp. She was still there. The snow that had been falling when Caleb asked her why she was still there kept falling through the night and into the next morning, and Rosalie was up before it stopped, because the snow didn't change what needed doing, and neither did the conversation she'd had the night before. She made breakfast. She cleared the pump again. She sent Eli and Mateo out with extra feed for the stock before the paths drifted any worse, and she stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at the white that had covered everything. The scorched earth where the cookhouse used to be, the garden she and Lillian had cleared, the road that led to town, and felt the particular quiet of a world muffled under a foot of new snow, which was a quiet that asked nothing of you and gave you, briefly, permission to not have an answer to anything. She went back inside and started the bread. Week 10 finished and week 11 began, and something in the rhythm of the ranch had shifted so gradually that she only noticed it when she stopped and looked at the full picture rather than the day-to-day. The men were different. Not dramatically, not the way things change in stories, where people had revelations and announced them, but in the accumulated small ways that were, she'd learned, the only kind of change that lasted. Henry Cole had started bringing the morning firewood to the kitchen door before she had to ask, which meant he was tracking her needs without being told to. Marcus, whose arm had healed enough for full work by the start of December, had taken it on himself to check the root cellar every few days and report to her just a brief word at breakfast. South walls holding, no new water, which meant he was thinking ahead. Samuel Reed had started eating properly again, and she'd seen him writing letters at the bunkhouse table on 2 Sunday evenings through the window when she was coming back from the garden. And Wyatt Dawson had come to her on a Wednesday in the second week of December and asked quietly, without looking directly at her, whether there was anything that needed doing around the kitchen before the next hard freeze. She'd given him the list of things she'd been managing around. The porch step that flexed too much, the window frame in the pantry that didn't seal right, the rusted hinge on the root cellar door that she had to fight with every morning. He did all 3 without mentioning them again. She didn't say anything about that to him either. Some things were better received without the comment. Lillian, for her part, had become something that Rosalie couldn't quite classify. Not a daughter, she was careful with that word, careful not to claim what wasn't hers. but the girl had settled into Rosalie's days in a way that felt permanent, like a piece of furniture that had always belonged in a particular corner and nobody could imagine the room without it. She was in the kitchen every morning before school and every afternoon after, and on the weekends she was there most of the day, watching and asking questions and occasionally offering opinions on the food that were wrong about half the time and right about half the time, which was a pretty good average for a 7-year-old. She had started calling Rosalie by her first name sometime in week 9. Not Miss Whitmore, just Rosalie, the way she said it naturally without it being a decision. Rosalie had let it be. The problem with week 11, the problem she hadn't seen coming the way she'd seen most of the other problems, was that she ran the numbers again. She did this on a Sunday evening in the second week of December, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone was in bed. She got out the notebook. She turned to the ledger she'd been keeping since the first week, the one that had every week's wages listed with her name, the date, and the running total of what she was owed. 11 weeks. At $8 a month, which was just under $2 a week, that was $22 in direct wages. Plus the supply gap she'd managed on her own judgment. Buying on her $20 budget what would have cost $60 if someone less careful had been doing it, which she'd noted as $40 in value add. Plus the medicine box assessment for Marcus, which had almost certainly prevented a doctor's visit that would have cost Caleb at least $15. She was conservative in her own accounting. She'd learned to be conservative because numbers that inflated in your favor had a way of embarrassing you later when reality corrected them. Even being conservative, even counting only the direct wages and none of the rest, she was owed $88. She sat with that number for a moment. $88. She had $11 in her coat pocket. The $11 she'd arrived with, which she hadn't touched because she hadn't needed to and because spending them felt too much like admitting she was settled here in a way she hadn't decided to be settled. She thought about the bank letter Henry had mentioned in the barn. End of February. Full payment or they start proceedings. Caleb had not talked to her about the bank situation since that night, and she had not asked. But she was not naive about what full payment by end of February meant for the spring wages he'd promised her. She thought about Clara Whitfield. $12 a month, private room, a guaranteed wage from a hotel that was not 3 payments behind on a banknote. She closed the notebook. She sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. Then she got up and went to bed, and she lay in the housekeeper's room listening to the wind, and she thought about the apple butter jars on the shelf in the pantry with the small labels Lillian had written in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, and she thought about Eli's face when she told him there was enough, and she thought about Caleb saying, "Why are you still here?" with nothing in his voice but genuine question. She was still asking herself the same thing. The answer she kept arriving at was one she didn't entirely trust, because it was a feeling. And feelings, in her experience, had a weak track record as a navigation. She was thinking all of this when she heard the sound. It was past midnight, and it came from downstairs. Not the house settling, not the usual sounds of a cold house contracting in the night air. Footsteps, small ones. She lay still and listened and heard them cross the kitchen floor. She got up. Lillian was standing in the kitchen in her nightgown and socks in front of the cold stove, not doing anything, just standing there. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't awake in any useful sense. She had the slightly vacant look of a child who has walked somewhere in her sleep and arrived without knowing how. Rosalie crossed the kitchen quietly and put her hand on Lillian's shoulder. "Hey," she said softly. "You're all right. You're in the kitchen." Lillian blinked, focused. "Rosalie?" "Right here." The girl looked around the kitchen like she was confirming it. Then she looked at Rosalie and something in her face crumpled. Not crying exactly, but the thing that came just before crying, that sudden awareness of where you are and where you thought you were, the gap between those two places. "I was looking for Mama," she said. Rosalie sat down on the kitchen floor because Lillian was on the floor effectively, and going to the chair felt like the wrong direction. She sat down with her back against the cabinet and held her arm out, and Lillian leaned against her without any more words about it. They sat there for a while. The kitchen was cold enough that Rosalie's breath made faint shapes. "She used to come down for water at night sometimes," Lillian said eventually. "I'd hear her, and sometimes I'd come down and she'd be here and she'd give me warm milk and we'd sit." "That's a good memory. I keep dreaming that she's here, and then I wake up and she's not." Lillian pulled her knees up. "Does that stop?" Rosalie thought about her own mother, about the year after. "It gets less frequent," she said. "It doesn't exactly stop, but it changes. It gets softer." "How long did it take?" "A few years." She felt Lillian absorb that number and think about it. "I know that seems long." "It is long." "Yes." She didn't argue with that. It was long. There was no point in pretending otherwise to a 7-year-old who was smart enough to know the difference. But the dreaming about her, that's not just a sad thing. It means she's still with you. Your mind keeps looking for her because she mattered. That part isn't only pain. Lillian was quiet for a moment. Is your mama gone too? Yes. Do you still dream about her? Sometimes. What do you do? Rosalie thought about it. I try to remember something specific, something small. The way she kept her kitchen or the particular way she folded bread dough, something that was just hers. She paused. It doesn't fix anything, but it makes the missing feel more like holding something instead of losing something. Does that make sense? Lillian considered it seriously. I think so. They sat on the kitchen floor for another few minutes, and then Rosalie got up and warmed milk on the stove, keeping the flame low, moving quietly. And they sat at the table and drank it, and she told Lillian about her mother's kitchen in Ohio, which was small and crowded and always smelled like onions and cornbread. And Lillian told her that her mother's kitchen had smelled like dried lavender because she kept a bunch of it over the window. And they talked about it quietly until Lillian's eyes started drooping and Rosalie took her back upstairs. She stood in the doorway of the small room until Lillian's breathing slowed all the way down. Then she went back to the housekeeper's room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she thought about what Clara Whitfield had said. A woman who worked without pay had no protection if things went wrong. That was true. She also thought about what it would mean practically to leave. Who would wake up when Lillian walked in her sleep? Who would know to cut Wyatt's portions slightly smaller on the mornings when he was most likely to be difficult, because something in the weather or the week had him edged toward trouble? Who would make sure Eli ate enough? Those were not reasons to stay in a place that might not pay you. She was clear-eyed about that. Those were the reasons she felt. And feelings were navigation, and navigation had to be weighed against the practical. She lay down and stared at the ceiling. She was still there in the morning. 2 days after the kitchen floor night, Caleb asked her to come with him to town. He needed to go to the general store and the bank, and he asked her in the morning before breakfast was cleared away, in front of Lillian and Eli, who were both still at the table, which meant it wasn't a secret kind of asking. She said yes, because she had her own list for the store, and it made sense to go together. The ride into town took 40 minutes in the wagon with the cold air coming straight at them and no good way to avoid it. Caleb was not a man who filled silence compulsively, which she'd come to appreciate. They made about 5 minutes of conversation about the road conditions and then rode without talking for a while. Bank first, he said when they reached town. I'll go to the store. Meet you there after. He nodded. She watched him cross the street toward the bank with the set of his shoulders that she recognized as the way he carried himself when he was walking into something difficult and knew it. She turned away and went to the store. She had her supplies ordered and was waiting for Hanson to total the bill when Clara Whitfield came in. She'd wondered if this would happen. Barrow Creek was small enough that 2 women with business in the same block would intersect if they were in town the same morning. Miss Whitmore. Clara set her basket on the counter. How are things at the ranch? Managing. She watched Hanson write up the total. Still managing on no wages from what I hear. Rosalie looked at her. Clara's expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a woman who had made her offer and was checking whether the answer had changed. The hotel position is still open? Rosalie asked. Through January, I think. After that, I'll have to make other arrangements. Clara said it without pressure, just as fact. You're good at what you do. I'd hate to wait and lose you to someone else in the territory. I appreciate the offer. She paid Hanson. I haven't decided. All right. Clara picked up her things. But Rosalie, she stopped, and something shifted in her expression. Less businesswoman, more woman who had been in difficult situations and remembered them. Don't wait until there's nothing left to decide with. That's the mistake women in our position make. We wait until the choice is made for us because we didn't want to be the one to make it. She left. Rosalie stood at the counter with her supplies. She was still standing there when Caleb came through the door. She could tell before he reached her. Something in the way he was walking. Controlled, careful. The walk of a man keeping his face neutral because the alternative was worse. Bad? She said. He took her bag of supplies before she could reach for it. End of February is now mid-January, he said. They moved it up again. She looked at him. How much time is that? 5 weeks. Maybe 6. He held the door for her. I have to get about $300 together by the 15th of January, or they start foreclosure proceedings. She stepped outside into the cold air. Is that possible? I have 40 head. I'd have to sell them now in December, which means I'll get 60 cents on the dollar for what they'd bring in spring, and that still might not cover it. He loaded the supplies into the wagon bed. I've been talking to Mateo. He has a cousin who runs cattle drives out of Cheyenne. If I can move the herd before Christmas, if prices don't drop anymore, Caleb, he stopped. Is it going to be enough? She asked. He looked at her with the honesty of a man who was too tired to manage her. I don't know, he said. She got up into the wagon. He came around and got up the other side, and they rode out of town in silence. And she had her notebook in her coat pocket, and she thought about the number she'd written in it 2 nights ago. $88. She thought about it all the way home. The drive back to the ranch gave her 40 minutes to work through something she didn't want to think about, which was the version of the future in which the bank moved forward with foreclosure. Not a small possibility anymore. A real one. 5 to 6 weeks. If the ranch went to the bank, her wages went with it. Not just future wages. All of them. The $88 she'd been keeping careful track of in her notebook would be a number on a page that nobody was legally required to honor. Ranch employees were not bank creditors. She knew enough about how these things worked to know that. And she had $11. She had $11 and the professional opinion of Clara Whitfield that she could step into a kitchen management position that would pay her $12 a month starting now. That night, she sat in the kitchen after everyone was in bed, and she opened her notebook and she looked at the ledger. She also looked at the supply records she'd been keeping alongside it. Every purchase, every decision, every substitution she'd made when the expected supply wasn't available. She'd been recording it partly out of habit and partly because she believed that work done invisibly was easier to dismiss, and she had been dismissed enough times in her life to build habits against it. She added up the supply numbers again. She'd spent $40 of Caleb's money over 11 weeks. She'd achieved, by her careful calculation, what would have cost at minimum $90 done without her expertise. That was $50 in effective savings. She'd also prevented the full loss of the root cellar stores by catching the wall damage when she did. The cost to replace everything she'd saved was, conservatively, $30 more. The numbers were clear. She closed the notebook and held her hands flat on the table. She had been. She realized with a precision that was almost physical, doing something no one here had asked her to do and no one here had acknowledged. She had been running this ranch's domestic operation with the discipline and foresight of someone who had a stake in its survival. She had been acting like someone with a stake in its survival. She did not, legally or practically, have any such stake. The realization sat in her chest with an uncomfortable weight. She got up. She went to the pantry and stood in it with a lamp and looked at the shelves she'd organized, the jars she'd labeled, the careful allocation of what was there and what they'd need. She could leave right now, walk to town in the morning, take the hotel position. It was the practical thing to do. She stood in the pantry for a long time. Then she went back to the table and opened the notebook again, and she turned to a blank page, and she wrote out a different kind of list. Not a ledger this time, but the things she'd need to do in the next few weeks regardless of what she decided about her own situation. The ranch's supplies. The January plan for feeding Mateo and some of the men were away for it. The adjustments she'd need to make to the meal schedule if the household shrank temporarily. She was halfway through the list before she noticed she was making it. She put down the pencil. She sat there looking at it. The next morning was a Thursday, and Thursdays had developed their own rhythm at the ranch. The men were usually out on the far section of fence, which was a long ride, and they came back later than usual and hungry in a particular way that the regular supper didn't quite address. So she'd started making Thursday suppers bigger, a heavier stew or a roasted piece of meat when she had it. She'd started doing this without saying anything about it, just adjusting, and nobody had commented on it. But the Thursday table had a different energy than other nights. More settled, the men taking longer to push back their chairs. She had a venison roast today. Mateo had brought it in the previous weekend. He was the best hunter on the ranch, quiet and precise with a rifle in the way he was quiet and precise about most things. And she'd been saving it for a Thursday. She was preparing it when Caleb came to the kitchen door at a time he didn't usually appear. He looked like a man who had been thinking hard all morning and had arrived at a conclusion he wasn't sure how to deliver. "Sit down," she said, because he was hovering and it was easier. He sat. He watched her work for a moment. "I'm going to tell you something I should have told you 2 weeks ago," he said. "All right." "When I went to the bank last week before the trip to town, I already knew they were going to move the deadline. I had a letter before you and I went in together. I'd had it 3 days. She set down the knife. She turned around. "I didn't tell you," he said. "I kept thinking I'd figure out something before I had to say it out loud. And then in town you asked me directly and He stopped. "I told you, but I'd already had 3 days to decide whether to tell you." "Why are you telling me now?" He looked at the table. Because Clara Whitfield told me she'd spoken to you. She saw me on the street this morning coming back from the feed store. Rosalie said nothing. She told me she'd made you an offer, Caleb said. And she told me... He stopped again, looking like the words were costing him more than usual. She told me she thought you'd stay because of us, and that if I was the kind of man she thought I was, I wouldn't let you do that without knowing the full picture. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara Whitfield said that, Rosalie said. She did, in front of the feed store with no particular embarrassment about it. Something crossed his face that might have been, in different circumstances, close to rueful. She has strong opinions about situations. Rosalie turned back to the venison and picked up the knife again, not because she was going to use it, but because she needed something to do with her hands. So, she said, full picture. Full picture is that I don't know if I can save this ranch. The cattle sale might cover it, might not. I'm selling at the worst possible time. If I come up short, even a little short, the bank isn't going to be flexible. He paused. If the ranch goes to foreclosure, I can't pay you any of it. I want you to know that clearly. She kept her hands on the counter. I already knew that. I thought you might. I have known for a while. He was quiet for a moment. Then why... I'm still deciding, she said. I haven't made a decision yet. Clara's position is better than anything I can offer you right now. I know. I'm not going to tell you to stay, he said. I want to. Lillian. He stopped. Started again. It would change things if you left, for her, and for... He didn't finish that either. But I'm not going to ask you to stay somewhere that can't pay you fair wages just because it would be easier for us. She turned around. He was looking at her the way he sometimes did, the way that had gotten more frequent in the last few weeks without either of them commenting on it. That direct, careful look that said he was seeing her and not the category she usually got placed in before anyone took the time. I'll tell you when I've decided, she said. He nodded. He got up. He put the chair back precisely where it had been, which was a detail about him she'd noticed. He always put things back exactly where they were. Furniture, tools, everything, like he was trying to account for the space he took up. He walked out of the kitchen. She made the venison roast. She made the Thursday supper. Everyone came in from the fence line cold and hungry, and the kitchen was warm, and the stew was there alongside the roast. And nobody at the table that night knew what had been said in the kitchen that afternoon, and nothing showed on anyone's face that would have told them. After supper, she went upstairs. She stood in the housekeeper's room and looked at her trunk, which she'd unpacked almost entirely in the first week, the cooking tools distributed through the kitchen, the clothes in the small wardrobe, her mother's recipe book and oilcloth on the shelf above the bed. She opened the recipe book. Her mother's handwriting was dense and practical, no flourishes, every recipe written the way her mother talked, direct, with the assumption that you already knew the basics and just needed the specifics. There were notes in the margins. Halve the salt if you're using cured meat. Double this for a crowd. Don't trust the oven, feel the heat. She sat on the edge of the bed with the recipe book open, 3 days before she had to give Clara an answer. The next morning, she got up before dawn and started breakfast, and by the time the first of the men was up, the coffee was on, and the bread was in the oven, and the kitchen was warm. Henry Cole came first, as he always did, and she handed him a cup without a word, and he nodded and went to the barn. Eli came second, earlier than usual. He came in looking like a person who'd been awake for a while, which she recognized because she'd had plenty of mornings that looked like that herself. He sat at the table, and she put bread in front of him, and he ate a piece without talking. You all right? She asked. I heard something last night, he said, from the bunkhouse. Wyatt and Henry talking. He looked up. Are you leaving? She kept her back to him, checking the oven. Who said that? Wyatt said Clara Whitfield made you an offer. Henry said it was better than anything the ranch could give you. He was quiet for a moment. Is it true? She came and sat down across from him. She looked at him directly because he was 17 and deserved a direct answer. I haven't decided, she said. Something in his face tightened. He nodded like he'd already calculated for this possibility and was just confirming the number. Eli. It makes sense, he said. You should take it. The ranch is... He stopped. It makes sense. She watched him. He was doing the thing she'd noticed in the first weeks. The thing where he made himself smaller, made his needs smaller, accommodated the absence before it happened so it would hurt less. I said I haven't decided, she said. That's true. It doesn't mean I'm going. But you might? I might. He nodded again. He finished his bread. He got up and put the plate on the counter. He'd started doing that in the third week without being asked. And he went out to the barn. She sat at the table for a moment, then she got up and finished breakfast. The day passed the way days did, by doing what needed to be done with the time available to do it. She worked the kitchen and the pantry and checked in on the root cellar, and talked to Lillian about arithmetic in the afternoon when Lillian came home from school. They had this routine. Lillian would sit at the kitchen table and do her schoolwork, while Rosalie started supper prep, and occasionally she'd ask questions that were sometimes about the work, and sometimes about something she'd been thinking about all day and hadn't had anyone to ask yet. Today she wanted to know whether math was used in cooking. Constantly, Rosalie said. Like what? How many people I'm feeding times how much each person needs times how many days before I can buy more supplies. That's multiplication and planning at the same time. She handed Lillian a turnip to peel, which Lillian now did competently. If I have a recipe that makes enough for 4 people and I need to feed 8, what do? Double everything? Right, and if I only have 3 eggs and the recipe calls for 4? Lillian thought about it. Find a way to make do with 3, or figure out what the egg does in the recipe and whether something else can substitute. She kept chopping. Math tells you the numbers. Knowing what the numbers mean is the other part. Lillian peeled her turnip. My teacher says I'm good at math. Your teacher is right. She says I should practice more at home. A pause. Will you help me? Yes, Rosalie said. It came out without hesitation, and she heard herself say it, and she thought about that. The automatic, yes, no calculation, no caveat. Lillian didn't notice anything unusual. She just said, okay, and went back to her turnip. That evening, Rosalie sat in the kitchen after everyone was in bed and opened the notebook for the last time. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the supply records. She looked at the blank page where she'd started writing the January plan. She looked at all of it for a long time. Then she picked up the pencil and she wrote something at the top of the blank page. Not the January plan, something else. She wrote, "What are you staying for?" She sat with that for a while. Then under it she wrote a list, and it was not the practical list, it was the other list, the one she'd been avoiding writing because writing it down made it real in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. Lillian. Eli's face when told there's enough. Wyatt fixing the window latch without being asked. Thursday suppers. The kitchen floor at midnight. The way the men don't rush to leave anymore. She looked at the list. She turned the page over. On the back, she wrote the other list. $88 owed, 0 paid. Foreclosure possible in 5 weeks. $11 in your coat pocket. Clara Whitfield, 12 a month. Private room. A woman who works without pay has no protection. She sat with both sides of it. Outside, the wind had come back up, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. The one Wyatt had fixed, the one that now rattled only a little instead of a lot. She closed the notebook. She sat in the kitchen for a long time, not deciding, just sitting. And then, on the last night of week 11, she did something she hadn't done since she arrived. She opened her trunk. She began to pack. She didn't finish packing that night. She got as far as the cooking tools, the ones she'd distributed through the kitchen in the first week, her mother's cast iron ladle, the 2 specialized knives she'd brought from Ohio, the heavy wooden spoon with the crack in the handle that she'd never gotten around to replacing because the crack didn't affect the function. She wrapped each one in the oilcloth she kept for the purpose and set them in the trunk, and then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at what she'd packed and felt something she couldn't name precisely, somewhere between relief and grief, which was not a combination she trusted. She left the trunk half-packed and went to sleep. In the morning, she unpacked the cooking tools and put them back where they belonged. Not because she'd decided to stay, because she needed the ladle for breakfast, and that was the only reason she let herself think about. She made breakfast, she cleared the pump, she sent the men out, she helped Lillian with her braids because the girl had woken up with them half undone again, and the left one was so tangled it required patient work with a fine-tooth comb and someone who knew what they were doing, which Lillian, for all her competence in the kitchen, did not yet apply to her own hair. Hold still, Rosalie said. It pulls. I know. Hold still anyway. Lillian held still. Are you leaving? Rosalie's hands paused. One small beat, no more. Where did you hear that? I heard Pa and Henry talking last night, through the floor. She said it the way children admitted things. Directly, without strategy, because they hadn't yet learned that admitting what you'd overheard was supposed to feel like a confession. Pa said you might go to the hotel. Rosalie separated the section of hair carefully. Your father and I have talked about it. Are you going? She thought about the notebook. The 2 lists on either side of a page. The trunk with the cooking tools in it, and then not in it. I don't know yet. she said. Lillian was quiet for a moment, which was different from her usual quiet. This one had something held in it. If you go, she said, will you come back? I'll still be in Barrow Creek. I'd see you. That's not the same. No, Rosalie agreed. It's not. She finished the braid. She tied it off and did the second one and sent Lillian to get her school things. And she stood in the hallway for a moment after the girl disappeared into her room and thought about the particular weight of that exchange, which was not a small weight. She went back to the kitchen. She had 2 days left before she needed to give Clara an answer. She spent those 2 days doing what she always did, which was the work. There was always work. She had found, in the 11 weeks at the ranch, that work was the one thing she could count on to mean something regardless of everything else that was uncertain. The bread still needed making, the stove still needed tending. The numbers in her supply records still needed to be accurate. The work didn't care what she decided about her own future, and in that way, it was more reliable than most things she'd encountered. On the second day, something happened in the barn. She only found out about it afterward, from Eli, who came to the kitchen door at mid-morning looking like he'd been part of something he wasn't sure how to report. Wyatt and Marcus had words, he said. She turned from the stove. About what? He came in and stood near the table, not sitting, the way he did when he had information he was still sorting. About you. About whether you were going. He paused. Wyatt said it was probably for the best, that you going to the hotel would be a better arrangement all around. Rosalie said nothing. Marcus said that was a coward's way of saying they'd gotten comfortable with you being here and didn't want to admit it. Eli's voice was careful. Wyatt told him to mind his business. Marcus told him this was his business. Did it get past words? Henry stepped in before it went further. He finally sat. But it wasn't nothing. She turned back to the stove. Marcus shouldn't fight that battle. He wasn't fighting it for himself. She stirred the pot. I know. Eli was quiet for a moment. Wyatt's not... He doesn't actually want you to go. I think he just doesn't know how to say the other thing. I know that too. He fixed the window latch, Eli said, like that was evidence. I noticed. She kept cooking. The pot needed another 10 minutes, and she focused on the heat, adjusting the damper slightly, feeling the difference in the warmth coming off the stove. Outside the kitchen window, the sky had the flat white quality that meant more snow before afternoon, and she cataloged that the way she cataloged everything, practically, as a thing that would affect the day. Eli, she said without turning around. Ma'am. The thing I told you in the root cellar. About being careful rather than slow. A pause. I remember. That was true. I don't say things I don't mean. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him, understanding the implication of that. If she didn't say things she didn't mean, then what she'd said to him was something she stood behind. And if she stood behind it, it was worth holding on to regardless of what happened next. Yes, ma'am, he said. He got up and went back to his work. She made lunch. The afternoon of the second day, an hour before she needed to start supper, she walked to the barn to talk to Caleb. She'd been working up to this all day, and there was no point in waiting any longer, because 2 days meant 2 days, and the second one was almost done. She found him mending tack, which he did when he needed to do something with his hands and think at the same time. He looked up when she came in. She sat down on the hay bale across from him. Same one as before. He recognized the position. She could see him register it. I'm going to give Clara my answer tomorrow, she said. He set down the leather strap. What are you going to tell her? She looked at the barn floor for a moment. I've been going back and forth for 2 weeks, and I keep arriving at the same problem, she said. If I stay here and the ranch goes under, I have nothing. No wages, no security, nothing to show for 11 weeks of work except a supply ledger nobody's legally required to care about. That's true. If I go to the hotel, I have a guaranteed wage and a position that will last. She paused. And everything I've built here, the supply system, the root cellar plan, the winter adjustments I've made, none of that carries forward in any useful way. Someone else has to figure it all out again. Also true. And Lillian, she stopped herself, started again. Lillian is not my child, and I don't have a claim on her, and I know that. Caleb was very still. But she walks in her sleep sometimes, Rosalie said, and when she does, she comes to the kitchen, and she needs someone to be there. He said nothing. I'm telling you this not because it's the thing that changes my decision, she said carefully. I'm telling you because you should know it's happening and you should be the one getting up for it, not just me. He absorbed that. I didn't know she'd been walking in her sleep. 3 times since I've been here. She's looking for her mother. She held his gaze. She needs her father. He looked down at his hands. This was a different kind of silence than the ones she was used to from him. This one had something shaky in it underneath the controlled surface. I know, he said quietly. I know He stopped. After Margaret died, I kept telling myself the ranch had to come first. That if I lost the ranch, there'd be nothing for Lillian anyway. And somewhere in there, another stop. I kept the lights on. I kept her fed. I wasn't there the way I should have been. You were surviving, Rosalie said. She needed more than survival. She didn't argue with that. It was true, and he knew it was true, and telling him otherwise would have been easier than telling the truth, but easier wasn't what he needed right now. She knows you love her, Rosalie said. That's not in question, but she needs more of your time, your specific attention, not the ranch's leftovers. He was quiet for a long time. I'll do better, he said. Not a promise with any performance in it, just a statement. Good. She stood up. I'll give Clara my answer tomorrow morning. What is it going to be? She looked at him. I'll tell you tonight. She walked back to the kitchen and made supper, and she thought about what she'd said to him. I'll tell you tonight, which meant she knew what the answer was. She'd known before she went to the barn. She'd known when she repacked the cooking tools that first morning, if she was being honest with herself, but she'd needed the 2 days to make sure it was a decision and not a feeling. The distinction mattered to her. After supper, after the kitchen was clean and the men were in the bunkhouse and Lillian was in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook. She opened it to the 2-sided page, the lists on either side. She read through both of them. Then she turned to the back of the notebook, to the wage ledger. She thought about Clara Whitfield's $12 a month. She thought about what it would mean to know, with certainty, every month, what she'd earned and when she'd receive it. She thought about what it felt like to be the person who walked away from a place that might not survive, knowing she'd done everything she could for it. She closed the notebook. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway at 8:30, the way she'd expected he would. I'm staying, she said, before he could speak. He stood in the doorway. Something moved across his face. Rosalie, I have conditions. He came in and sat down across from her. She noticed he sat differently than he had in the first weeks. Less like a man sitting at someone else's table, more like a man sitting at his own. The wage ledger I've been keeping becomes a formal record, witnessed. She put the notebook on the table. You sign it. Henry Cole signs it as a witness. It's a legal document of what you owe me. All right. If the ranch goes to foreclosure, the wages are listed as a debt against the estate. I want that in writing. He nodded. Yes. $12 a month going forward, not $8. I've been worth $12 a month and we both know it. A pause. Then, yes. And if the cattle sale brings enough, if there's money after the bank is paid, I get the back wages first, before anything else that isn't essential. He looked at her steadily. Before I buy supplies for the ranch? Essential supplies, no. Discretionary spending, yes. She held his gaze. You said you wanted to make it right. That's what making it right looks like. That's fair, he said. It's more than fair, she said. It's accurate. He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but close. Is there anything else? She thought. You start having breakfast with your daughter. Every morning. Whatever's happening on the ranch, unless there's an emergency, you sit down and you eat breakfast with Lillian before you go out, even if it's 10 minutes. He was quiet. She's still here, Rosalie said. Don't let her feel like she has to walk in her sleep to find someone. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something in them was different. Yes, he said. All right. And you go with her to check on that apple tree in spring. When it starts budding, you do that with her. He nodded. He couldn't say anything for a moment. Those are my conditions, Rosalie said. I'll sign the ledger tonight, he said. I'll get Henry in the morning. She nodded. She pulled the notebook back toward her and opened it to the ledger page. He signed it where she indicated in his careful hand, and then he looked at the number at the bottom of the column, the running total of what he owed her. And his jaw tightened slightly, which was not guilt, she thought, but something closer to the particular discomfort of a decent man seeing his own debts written out clearly. I'm going to fix this, he said. I know you're going to try, she said, which was the accurate thing. Henry Cole was in the kitchen before breakfast the next morning, which meant Caleb had talked to him the night before. Henry was not a man who required much explanation for things. He read a situation in the time it took most people to orient themselves. And he looked at the notebook Rosalie put in front of him, read the ledger, and signed it with the blunt practicality of someone who thought this should have been done weeks ago and wasn't going to say so. Good, he said, and handed the notebook back. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Thank the fact that Caleb finally has some sense. He took his coffee and went to the barn. She went to town that morning and told Clara Whitfield she was declining the position. Clara received it without drama. "You're certain?" Clara asked. "Yes." Clara looked at her for a moment with the assessing expression she wore when she was deciding how much to say. "He's a good man, Caleb Barrow. He's had a hard few years." "I know." You've done more for that ranch in 11 weeks than anyone did for it in the 2 years before you came." "I know that too." Clara smiled. "All right then. The offer stands if things change. You know where I am." Rosalie walked back to the ranch. The thing about a decision, once it was actually made, was that it rearranged the weight of things. She'd been carrying the two-sided page for 2 weeks, both lists pulling in opposite directions, and now that she'd set it down, she could feel the difference in her shoulders. She was still in the same situation. No wages yet, a ranch that might not survive, a family that wasn't hers and also somehow was. But the uncertainty had a shape now, and a shape was easier to carry than an open question. She made lunch, she kept her records, she started planning for January. On Friday of the following week, Caleb and Mateo and Samuel left with the herd. She'd known this was coming and had prepared for it. The bunkhouse meals adjusted for 3 fewer men, the workload redistributed, the particular quiet that would settle over a ranch when its livestock was gone, and the hands who went with them had taken some of the daily noise along. She stood at the gate and watched them go. 40 head moving down the road in the December cold with 3 men behind them, and then she went back to the kitchen. Wyatt, Marcus, Henry, and Eli remained. The 4 of them settled into a different pace than the full crew, quieter, less the energy of 6 men in a shared space. Henry took on some of Caleb's oversight duties without being asked, which was the kind of man he was. Marcus was near full strength in his arm now and worked the fence line with Eli. Wyatt was Wyatt, capable, consistent, and still carrying whatever particular internal weather he operated under. The second day, after the others left, Wyatt came to the kitchen door at an odd hour. Not mealtime, not the early morning coffee, just mid-morning, which was unusual. "You need something?" Rosalie asked. He stood in the doorway. He had his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed he did when he was approaching something with some difficulty. "I owe you something," he said. She turned to look at him properly. "What I said, in the second week." He was looking at the doorframe rather than at her. "About hauling. I said it where I thought you wouldn't hear, but you heard, and He stopped. It was a poor thing to say. She looked at him steadily. She thought about Eli telling her he doesn't actually want you to go. She thought about the window latch and the porch step and the hinge on the root cellar door. "You've been doing repair work around the kitchen for 3 weeks, she said. "That's not..." He shook his head. "That's not an apology. I'm apologizing now." "All right." He looked at her. He'd expected more than that, she could see. "Wyatt," she said, "I know what I look like to a certain kind of man the first time he sees me. I've been managing that my whole life. What I care about is what happens after." She paused. "What happened after was that you did the work. That matters more to me than the first impression." He turned his hat in his hands. "You didn't have to make it easy." "No," she said. "But you did the work, and I'm not going to make someone work for forgiveness they've already earned." She went back to the stove. "Breakfast is ready in 20 minutes. Don't be late." He wasn't late. The week that Caleb was gone had its own rhythm, and she found, unexpectedly, that she was capable of sitting with uncertainty in a way she hadn't been before she came to this ranch. She'd arrived here as a woman with $11 and no backup plan, and somewhere in 11 weeks she'd built enough knowledge of this place and these people that uncertainty didn't rattle the same way. She knew what the food would do through January. She knew which men would carry the work and which ones needed managing toward it. She knew that Lillian would be better on the days Rosalie let her help in the kitchen and harder on the days she had nothing to do with her hands. She knew the ranch. That was a different thing from owning it or being permanently part of it. But it was something real. On the 4th day, a letter came. It was from the bank, addressed to Caleb, and she set it on the table and did not open it and did not allow herself to speculate, because she had learned that speculating about things you couldn't control was a particular form of self-torture she'd gotten better at avoiding. Lillian saw it when she came home from school. "Is that from the bank?" she asked. "Address it to your father," Rosalie said. "Leave it alone." Lillian left it alone. She sat at the table and did her arithmetic and only glanced at the envelope once or twice. Rosalie thought about what it was to be 7 years old and know that a particular kind of envelope on the table meant the adults in your life were worried, and to not be able to do anything about it, and to sit and do your arithmetic anyway. She put extra on Lillian's supper plate. On the 6th day, Henry came to the kitchen at the end of the afternoon and sat down at the table without being invited, which was not something he normally did. She put coffee in front of him and sat across from him. "You know what's in that letter," he said. I didn't open it." He looked at her. "I know someone who works at the bank, in the record office." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "The deadline's been moved up again, to January 8th. She sat with that. "How much time is that?" 11 days from now." "Has Caleb gotten a good price for the herd?" "I don't know. I haven't heard." She looked at the envelope on the table. "He needs to know." "I know. I sent a rider to Cheyenne this morning. It'll reach him in 2 days." She nodded. "If the sale doesn't cover it," Henry started. "Don't," she said. "Not yet. Wait and see what the sale brings." He drank his coffee. "You're a steady person. Right now, I'm a person trying not to think about something I can't control." She got up. "Supper's at 6. Caleb came back on the 9th day. She heard the wagon before she saw it, and then the sound of horses and voices. He'd brought Mateo and Samuel with him. And she looked out the kitchen window and saw him climbing down from the wagon seat before it had fully stopped, which was not the movement of a man who'd had a good trip. She went to the door. He came up the porch steps and looked at her, and she could see it in his face. Not disaster, not victory, something complicated in the middle. "How much?" she asked. He stopped on the porch. $262. She did the math immediately. "That's 38 short. 38 short, he confirmed. "At the current deadline, which I know has moved again, Henry's letter reached me in Cheyenne. I have 11 days. He looked like a man who had ridden hard for 2 days on the back of a number that wasn't enough. "I sold at every stop. I took every price I could get. It wasn't enough." She stepped back from the door. "Come inside." He came in. She put coffee in front of him, and she sat down at the table and she thought. I watched her think, which was something she'd noticed he'd gotten comfortable with. Her silences, the way she sometimes needed to work through something before she could say anything useful about it. "What does the ranch have that's sellable?" she asked. "I've been through it. The horses are working stock. I can't sell them and keep the operation going. The equipment," he shook his head. "Most of it's necessary." "The apple crop last fall. You sold any of it?" "Some. Kept the rest." "There are 14 jars of apple butter in the pantry," she said. "Preserved vegetables, dried fruit, the root cellar stores." She paused. "I've been building up a surplus these last 3 weeks because I was running lean in January's favor. We have more preserved goods than we need for winter if we're careful." He looked at her. "You're suggesting we sell the stores. I'm suggesting you think about what you have." She pulled the supply notebook toward her. "If I sell down to the minimum needed for winter, and I mean minimum, we'd be back to lean. I think there's $30 to $40 in preserved goods you could move. Hanson takes farm goods. The hotel takes them too." He sat back. He looked at the notebook. "That would cover the gap. If the prices hold." He rubbed his face. He was tired in the particular way of someone who's been calculating for days and hasn't stopped. "You'd be undoing everything you built up." "The stores can be rebuilt in spring," she said. "The ranch can't be rebuilt once the bank takes it." He looked at her. "Go to the pantry," she said. "Look at what's there. Tell me what you're willing to sell and what's absolutely necessary, and we'll figure out the rest." He went to the pantry. She sat at the table and listened to him moving around in there. The sound of jars being moved and counted, the particular quiet of a man trying to understand something that someone else had built. He came back after 10 minutes. "There's more in there than I knew," he said. "I know." "You did this in 3 weeks?" "I was planning ahead." She pulled the notebook toward her. "Sit down and let's go through it." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, working through what could be sold and at what price and in what time. She knew the numbers cold. She'd been keeping them for 11 weeks, and she knew this pantry the way she knew her own hands. He contributed what he knew about Hanson's prices and what the hotel paid for preserved goods, and together they assembled a plan that, if prices held and Hanson took what they hoped he'd take, would cover 36 of the $38. "That's still too short," he said. "I have $11, she said. He looked at her. "Rosalie, it comes off the top of what you owe me. Add it to the ledger." She kept her voice even. "That's not charity, that's a loan at terms we agree on right now." He was quiet for a moment. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's practical," she said. "If the ranch goes under, I lose all of what you owe me. If the ranch survives, I lose $11 against what you owe me and gain a functioning operation." She met his eyes. "The math isn't complicated." He looked at her for a long time. "It's not just the math," he said quietly. No, she said. It's not just the math. They held that for a moment. The thing that was not just the math, the thing neither of them had said directly. The thing that had been building in the kitchen on Thursday evenings and in the barn on hay bales and in the pantry doorway and in the question, why are you still here? That she still hadn't answered completely. We'll get through January, she said finally. Then we'll talk. He nodded. January 1st, he said, like it was a date. January 1st, she agreed. The next 4 days were the hardest kind of work. Not the physical work, which she could manage, but the precision work. The work of taking a pantry she'd built carefully and dismantling part of it in a way that left enough behind to sustain the household. She moved through it methodically, Lillian helping where she could, Henry and Mateo making 2 trips to town with the wagon loaded. Hanson bought everything they brought him. He didn't ask questions. He knew good preserving when he saw it, and Rosalie's work was good. The hotel took the apple butter. Clara Whitfield came out to accept the delivery herself, and she looked at the jars and then at Rosalie with an expression that was partly professional appreciation and partly something else. 14 jars, Clara said. 14. I'll take all of them. She named a fair price. And anything else you put up in spring, I'll take on standing order. Rosalie looked at her. That's generous. That's business, Clara said, and paid in cash. On the morning of January 8th, Caleb took $302 to the bank. She watched him go from the kitchen window. She kept her hands busy with the breakfast cleanup. Lillian sat at the table watching her, very still, with the awareness of a child who understands that something important is happening without fully understanding what. Is Papa going to fix it? Lillian asked. He's trying his hardest, Rosalie said. Is that enough? She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and came to sit across from Lillian. Sometimes trying your hardest is enough and sometimes it isn't. What matters is that you do it anyway. Lillian thought about that. Mama used to say that doing your best was the only thing you could be sure of. Your mama was right. She was right about most things. A pause. Rosalie, what happens if the bank says no? She looked at this 7-year-old girl with her careful braids and her serious eyes, and she thought about what to say that was honest without being cruel. Then we figure out the next step, she said. Just the one step, not the whole road. Lillian looked at her. Did someone teach you that? Yes, Rosalie said. Someone very wise. She went back to the stove. Caleb came back at noon. She heard the wagon and she didn't go to the window. She kept working. She heard his boots on the porch steps, the particular sound of them, and she turned when he came through the door. His face was different. She set down what she was holding. $302, he said. The bank accepted it. We have until May for the next scheduled payment. He stopped in the middle of the kitchen, and he looked like a man who has been braced for impact for so long that when it doesn't come, he doesn't entirely know what to do with his body. She nodded. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully admitted was there. We're all right, he said. For now, she said, because she was always going to be the one to say for now, and they both knew it. He almost laughed at that. Just almost. He crossed the kitchen, and he stood in front of her, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since approximately week 7, and she looked back at him the same way she'd been trying not to. January 1st, he said. It's the 8th, she said. We're a week late. Then we're already behind. He held out his hand, which was an odd gesture, and she looked at it, and she understood it was an offering. Not a demand, not an expectation, just an opening. She put her hand in his. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she squeezed his hand once and let go because supper wasn't going to make itself and Lillian would be home from school in 2 hours and the wood needed checking before the afternoon got cold. $12, she said, going back to the stove. You owe me $12 for January, 1st of the month. 1st of the month, he agreed. He stood in the kitchen for another moment, not moving, like a man savoring something he'd been waiting a long time for. Then he put on his coat and went out to see to the horses. She kept cooking. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the wind had come back, running along the eaves the way it did, finding all the places where the house was imperfect, which was most of them. The stove held its heat. The pantry, reduced but functional, held enough. She made supper. The men came in from the cold, and Lillian came home from school, and Caleb came in last after everyone else was seated and sat down at the head of his table, his whole table, all of it still his. And she brought the pot out from the stove and set it in the center and sat down herself, because she had established in week 3 that she ate with the household, not after it, and nobody had argued. Henry looked around the table. Good day, he said, which was not his usual opener. Caleb looked at him. We're still here, he said. Henry nodded once, satisfied with that, and reached for the bread. Rosalie looked at the table. at all of them, the men who doubted her and then hadn't, the girl who'd unlatched the gate on the first day and held it open, the man at the head of the table who'd told her the truth when she'd asked for it, and she thought about the 2 lists she'd written on either side of a page. She thought about how most decisions looked like math and turned out to be something else entirely. Then Lillian asked someone to pass the butter, and the meal went on. January passed the way hard months do. Slowly at first, then all at once. And then you looked back and couldn't quite account for where the time had gone. The ranch ran lean through the first 3 weeks of it, which was what Rosalie had planned for and what she'd told Caleb to expect. She'd dismantled enough of the stored surplus to make the bank payment, and what remained in the pantry was functional but not comfortable, and she managed it the way she managed everything. By knowing exactly what she had and making deliberate decisions about every piece of it. There was no waste. There was also, most days, enough. The men adjusted without complaint. She thought they would. By January, they'd been eating her cooking for 3 months, and they trusted her judgment about the kitchen, even when what came out of it was simpler than what they'd gotten used to. She noticed that nobody pushed back on the leaner meals. Nobody commented on the absence of things she'd been putting on the table in December. They just ate what was there and said thank you and went back to work. She thought that was its own kind of respect, and she valued it more than she would have valued compliments. Caleb had his breakfast with Lillian every morning. She noticed this the way she noticed most things, without making anything of it aloud, just cataloging it as a change that had taken hold. He was up earlier than he'd been in the months before she arrived, earlier even than Henry some mornings, and he sat at the kitchen table with his daughter while Rosalie worked the stove, and they talked about things that were small and things that were not small, and she let the sound of it be background to her work rather than something she paid direct attention to. It wasn't her conversation, but it warmed the kitchen in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. One morning in the 3rd week of January, she heard Lillian tell him about a dream she'd had, not the sleepwalking kind. An ordinary dream, a confusing one, with fragments of school and horses and something about a red coat she didn't own. She told it the way children told dreams, circuitously, with the casual confidence that the listener would find it as interesting as she did. Caleb listened to the whole thing. He asked a question about the red coat. Rosalie kept her back to them and cracked eggs into the pan and thought about the 2 lists on either side of a page and the fact that some things really did turn out to be worth more than the math. February came in with a cold snap that froze the pump solid for 3 days running, which meant the morning routine of heating water and clearing it became the first task of every day before anything else could happen. She did it without resentment. The cold was the cold. It didn't mean anything about her or about the ranch or about whether she'd made the right decision. It just meant the pump was frozen and she had to deal with it. Wyatt started doing it on the 2nd day, before she was up. She came downstairs to find the pump already cleared, the water barrel already topped up, and Wyatt's boot prints in the snow on the porch leading back toward the bunkhouse. She stood at the kitchen door for a moment, looking at the boot prints. She never said anything about it. He never said anything about it. Said anything. But he did it every morning for the rest of the cold snap, and she made sure his coffee was on the table before anyone else's when he came in for breakfast. And that was the whole of it, which was, she thought, about as much of an ongoing conversation as the 2 of them needed. The cattle situation resolved itself better than Caleb had dared to hope, though not as well as Rosalie had privately calculated in the optimistic column. He got word in the 2nd week of February that a buyer in Cheyenne, someone Mateo's cousin had connected him to during the December drive, wanted first option on the spring herd at a price that was better than anything the December sale had brought. Not extraordinary, but fair, and fair in the spring was better than discounted in December by enough of a margin that when Caleb showed her the letter, he looked like a man who'd been handed back something he'd resigned himself to losing. "It's enough for the May payment," he said, "with some left." "How much left?" she asked. He told her the number. She did the arithmetic in her head. "That covers what you owe me in back wages." He looked at her. Yes, all of it. She had kept the ledger, every entry, every week, the running total in her precise handwriting. $88 in back wages plus the $11 she'd contributed against the bank payment, plus 4 months at $12 going forward from January. The number was specific and documented, and she had never pretended otherwise. "You'll have it by May," he said. "I'll have it by May," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to pay it sooner. Pay the May banknote first, then pay me." She handed the letter back, in that order. "The bank doesn't have patience, and I do." He looked at her. "You've been patient for 5 months. And I've kept a ledger the whole time," she said. "I'm not patient out of softness. I'm patient because I knew what I was owed and I trusted you to pay it." She held his gaze. "There's a difference." "Yes," he said. "There is." He folded the letter. He stood in the kitchen, not quite leaving, which was something she'd learned to read, the way he lingered when there was something he hadn't yet found words for. "What?" she said. He looked at the table, then at her. "I keep thinking about that first day," he said. "You standing at the gate with that trunk. I almost sent you away." "I know. I almost told you there was nothing here for you." "I know that too." "What made you stay? That day, I mean. Not later. That first night." He was looking at her with genuine curiosity, not the rhetorical kind. "You sat down on that hay bale and you offered to look at the kitchen for a ranch that couldn't pay you. Why?" She thought about it. She thought about what was true rather than what sounded good. "I was tired," she said. "I dragged that trunk 2 miles in the cold and I had nowhere to go, and the alternative was finding a room in town on $11, which wasn't going to last long." She paused, and Lillian opened the gate. He waited. "A 7-year-old held the gate open for me," she said, "before she knew anything about who I was or what I was worth or whether there was any practical reason to let me in. She just opened it." She looked at the table. "I've had a lot of gates closed on me. I wasn't going to walk away from one that was open." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the most honest thing I've heard in a long time," he said. "I try to be honest." "I know you do." He did leave then, and she went back to the stove, and she stood there for a moment with her hands resting on the warm iron, thinking about the truth of what she'd said. It was honest. It was also not the whole truth, because the whole truth was more than she'd been ready to say out loud, which was that she had been a woman carrying a lifetime of doors closing on her. The door of Harlan Voss's land office, the door of every situation where she'd been assessed by her size before anything else about her had the chance to matter. And when Lillian had unlatched that gate and held it open with both hands, she had walked through it not just because she was tired and had nowhere else to go, but because something in her had needed very badly to walk through a door that opened for her rather than closed. The rest, she thought, had followed from that. March came, and with it mud and the particular chaos of a ranch coming out of winter, which was a different kind of work than the cold months. Not the careful rationing of resources, but the urgent replenishment of them. She started the kitchen garden in earnest as soon as the ground was workable, which was earlier than she'd expected given how the drainage had improved in the sections she and Lillian had cleared in the fall. The girl worked alongside her on the weekends with a focus that had gotten more purposeful over the winter, less watching and more doing. "These go here," Lillian said one Saturday, holding up a packet of turnip seeds with the authority of someone who had been paying attention since October. "They go there," Rosalie corrected, pointing to the section with the better drainage. Lillian looked at both sections. "Why that one? What happens to turnips if the water sits too long?" A pause while she thought. "They rot? The roots get waterlogged. They need moisture but not standing water. That section drains faster." Rosalie handed her the packet. "Plant them a hand width apart." Lillian planted them a hand width apart, measuring carefully with her actual hand, which Rosalie watched without comment. The measurement was imprecise, but the intention was right, and precision would come with practice. Caleb came out to the garden that afternoon, which he'd never done before. He looked at the cleared rows, the new plantings, the section where the apple tree was just beginning to show the first faint suggestion of buds on its branches. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at it. Lillian looked up from her planting. "Papa, come see." He crouched down next to her, and she showed him the turnip seeds and explained the drainage principle with the confidence of someone who'd learned something 20 minutes ago. He listened to all of it. Then he looked at the apple tree. He stood up and walked over to it and stood beside it, and Rosalie kept working and didn't watch directly, but she saw him put his hand on the bark just briefly, the way a person touches something they've been meaning to approach for a long time. Lillian came up beside him. She put her hand on the bark too, next to his. Rosalie turned back to the row she was working. Some things didn't need to be witnessed. They just needed to happen. April arrived with the smell of things coming back to life, which was a smell she'd always loved. That green, damp, specific smell of earth waking up after months of cold. The pantry was rebuilding. The kitchen garden had its first true growth. The herd that Caleb would take to Cheyenne in May was ready, healthy, and at a number that made the spring math work out the way it hadn't in December. She had been at Barrow Creek Ranch for 7 months. She thought about that on a Thursday evening in April while the men were still at the table and nobody was rushing to leave, which was still true, still something she noticed without it being remarkable anymore. Eli was talking about something he'd seen on the fence line, a hawk's nest apparently, in an unlikely spot. And Marcus was arguing good-naturedly about whether it was a hawk or a kestrel, and Henry was refereeing the argument with the weary authority of someone who knew more about birds than either of them, but didn't want to put an end to the conversation by just saying so. Caleb was watching his household. He caught her eye and she looked away first, the way she almost always did, though the gap between looking and looking away had been getting shorter for weeks. She'd noticed that too. After supper, after the kitchen was clean and Lillian was in bed and the bunkhouse had gone quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook. She turned to the ledger. She looked at the numbers. She thought about the woman who had sat on a trunk outside a gate in September with $11 and a letter that meant nothing and no good reason to stay. She thought about how that woman would have described herself then. Practical, capable, resigned to being underestimated, careful about hope because hope had a poor track record in her experience. She turned to a new page. She didn't write anything on it. She just looked at the blank page for a moment, thinking about what it meant to have one, to have used up enough of the previous pages that there was a new one available. This was not a metaphor she was reaching for. It was just what the notebook was doing. But she thought about it anyway, the way she thought about most things, with the part of her that was always making quiet sense of what she observed. She closed the notebook and went to bed. In the second week of April, Wyatt Dawson gave notice. He came to Caleb on a Tuesday and said he'd had the offer from the Chamber's operation renewed, and this time the terms were better and he was going to take it. He told Caleb first, and Caleb came and told her because she was, by this point, the person he consulted about household and staffing things as a matter of course. When? She asked. End of the month. She nodded. We'll need someone by May if you're taking the herd to Cheyenne. You can't make that drive short-handed. I know. I've been thinking about Mateo's cousin. He mentioned a man looking for steady work. Get him here by the 15th. Give Wyatt and whoever's new 2 weeks to overlap. She thought through the meal adjustments. It'll be fine. Caleb looked at her. You're not... He paused. You worked hard with Wyatt. He worked hard, she corrected. He did the work. She turned back to what she'd been doing. People move on. That's not a failing. Wyatt left on a Friday at the end of April, and she made a better supper than usual that night, not because she was sentimental about his leaving, but because she learned that the moments of transition were worth marking with a good meal even when the transition wasn't a sad one. He ate 2 plates, which was the most she'd ever seen him eat, and when he left the table, he stopped at the kitchen door. Miss Whitmore, he said. She looked at him. You run a good kitchen, he said. Thank you, Wyatt. He put his hat on and went out. She heard his boots across the porch. She went back to the cleanup. The new man, whose name was Pete Garza and who was Mateo's cousin's connection, arrived on the 12th. He was wiry and quiet and watched everything carefully before he said anything, which she respected. She fed him well from the first meal and didn't make any particular fuss about his arrival, just set his place at the table and let him find his footing, which seemed to be the right approach because he was functional and unobtrusive within the first week. Caleb left for Cheyenne with the herd on May 2nd. He took Mateo, Samuel, and Pete with him. Henry stayed, and Eli stayed, and Rosalie watched the herd move down the road from the gate with Lillian standing beside her. Lillian reached up and took her hand without looking at her. Rosalie held it. He'll be back in 10 days, Lillian said. About that. The last time he went, things changed. Rosalie looked down at her. How do you mean? When he came back in December, things felt different. She was looking at the road still. Better. Like something had been decided. Rosalie thought about the kitchen on January 8th, Caleb's face when he came through the door. We're still here. And then his hand, held out, and her hand in his, and the quiet of it. Some things were decided, she said. Good things? I think so. Lillian squeezed her hand once and let go and went back toward the house. Rosalie stood at the gate a moment longer, watching the last of the herd disappear around the bend in the road, thinking about good things and the shape they had when you were standing inside them instead of looking at them from the outside. She went back to the kitchen. Caleb came back on May 11th, which was 9 days, which was faster than she'd expected. She heard the wagon and she was at the stove and she didn't stop what she was doing, which was important to her in a way she didn't need to examine closely. She heard him come up the porch steps and she heard the kitchen door, and she turned when he came in because that was ordinary and because his face told her immediately what she needed to know. He looked like a man who was no longer carrying the particular weight he'd been carrying for 7 months. How much? She said. He put an envelope on the table. She dried her hands and opened it. She counted. The banknote covered, the back wages she was owed, all of it, every entry in the ledger. Her $11 contribution returned with the interest she'd never asked for, but he'd included anyway, which she would have argued about if she hadn't seen in his face that he needed to do it. She set the envelope down. "You're paid out," he said. "All of it. Current through May." She looked at the money on the table. 8 months of keeping the numbers, keeping the records, keeping the kitchen and the pantry and the household running on whatever the ranch could afford, and sometimes a little she provided herself. 8 months of working for a promise and a ledger entry. She'd said she was patient because she knew what she was owed and she trusted him to pay it. He'd paid it. She closed the envelope. She thought about what it was worth, that particular feeling. Not the money, though the money mattered, and she'd never been the kind of woman to pretend money didn't matter. The feeling underneath it. The feeling of having been seen clearly enough that someone thought your work was worth keeping track of and paying back. She thought about how rare that had been in her life. She put the envelope in her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "That was always yours." She looked at him. He was still standing on the other side of the kitchen table, and she thought about how many conversations they'd had across this table, how many things had been said and not said in this kitchen. How many mornings and suppers and late evenings when the household was asleep and the two of them were still in the kitchen because neither of them seemed to run out of things to think about in each other's company. "Caleb," she said. "Rosalie." She smiled at that. The simplest possible exchange, just their names, which contained everything they hadn't been direct about and somehow said it anyway. "Sit down," she said. "There's coffee." He sat down. She poured 2 cups and sat across from him, and they drank their coffee, and the kitchen was warm, and outside, the May evening was coming in slowly, with the smell of the garden through the window she'd left cracked. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right." "The ledger," he said. "It's paid out now. You have your wages. You have a position at $12 a month that's paid reliably." He wrapped his hands around his cup. I want you to know that you're not obligated by anything we said in the winter. Or anything before that. You made this ranch work when I couldn't, and you got paid for it, and if you wanted to take Clara Whitfield's position or anything else, that would be—" "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "You're telling me I can leave. I'm telling you that you're free, that nothing you've done here is a chain." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who put chairs back exactly where they'd been and listened to his daughter's dreams and signed a ledger without arguing about the numbers, because he believed a person's work should be accounted for. "I know I'm free," she said. "I've always known that." "Yes." He looked at the table. "I know you know it. I just wanted to say it." "And now you've said it." "Yes." She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside, the kitchen garden was coming up strong. The turnips, the carrots, the section her and Lillian had cleared in October, that had been the remnant of Margaret Barrow's careful work, now carrying Rosalie's work alongside it in the soil. "The apple tree is going to have a good year," she said. He looked up. "I checked it this morning. The blossoms held after the last frost. If nothing goes wrong between now and fall, you'll have more apples than last year." She set down her cup. Enough for the hotel standing order, and still some to spare. He was looking at her with something in his face that she'd stopped trying to name and started just letting be. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Because of the ranch," he said. Not a question. Testing the words to see what was in them. "Not only because of the ranch," she met his eyes. "You know that." "I know," he said. He stopped. He was better with practical speech than with the other kind, which was something they had in common, actually. She'd noticed that about herself more since she'd been here. How much of what she communicated went through action rather than declaration, through the Thursday suppers and the morning coffee and the notebook and the way she stayed. "January 1st, she said. He blinked. Then he recognized it. That was 5 months ago. "You said we'd talk after January. We've been talking since January. About ranch things." "Not only about ranch things." He said it carefully. "No," she agreed. "Not only." The kitchen was very quiet. Through the window, the evening had settled fully into itself, the last of the light going soft and low, and somewhere outside she could hear Eli coming back from the barn, his boots on the path, and in a few minutes Lillian would be done with her reading upstairs and would come down for the last small thing before bed that she always came down for, and Henry would check the stock one more time and the day would close the way days did. "I'd like to know," Caleb said, "what you'd say if I asked." She looked at him. "You'd have to ask." He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since approximately week 7, which was directly and without category, just as herself, just as the person who was actually there. "Rosalie," he said, "I'd like to ask you to stay. Not as a cook, not as someone who works here." He stopped, then kept going because stopping didn't make it easier. "As a permanent part of this. As mine. If you'd have me." She thought about the woman at the gate in September. The trunk, the $11, the letter that meant nothing. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere with nothing and build something real, not from materials that were given to you, but from what you could do and what you knew and who you were willing to be when it was hard. She thought about how long she'd been told in various ways by various circumstances that she was worth less than she was, worth less than a proper salary, worth less than a clear explanation, worth less than the basic acknowledgement that a woman could walk into a room and be the most capable person in it before anyone thought to look up from the door. She thought about what it was to be chosen by someone who had seen all of it, the work, the hard parts, the stubborn accounting, the moments she'd almost left, and was asking anyway. "Yes," she said, "just that. It was enough." He reached across the table and took her hand, which was the same gesture as January, careful, offered, not demanded, and she held it the same way she'd held it then, which was firmly, because she had never once in her life held anything she intended to keep with anything less than her full grip. They sat at the kitchen table until Lillian came downstairs. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, taking in the scene with 7-year-old directness. Her father at the table, Rosalie's hand in his, 2 coffee cups. "Did something happen?" she asked. Caleb looked at Rosalie. Rosalie looked at Lillian. "Come here," Rosalie said. Lillian came and stood beside her. Rosalie put her arm around her, which was the most natural thing she'd done all evening, and Lillian leaned in, the way she'd been leaning in since approximately week 3. "How would you feel," Rosalie said, "if I stayed, not just as the cook, permanently?" Lillian looked between them. The directness in her face shifted into something more careful, the way children looked when they understood that the question mattered in a large way and they were trying to get the answer right. "Like forever?" she said. "Like forever," Caleb said. Lillian looked at Rosalie. She seemed to be running some private calculation, the way she did with arithmetic, working through it methodically, checking her own answer. "Are you going to change things?" she said. "Some things," Rosalie said honestly, "not the apple butter." Lillian considered that. Then she leaned fully against Rosalie's side and said, "Okay." Just that. The way her father had said yes in January, simply without performance. Rosalie held her. They married in June, on a Saturday when the weather was warm and the kitchen garden was full and the apple tree had blossomed and set its fruit and the whole ranch smelled like something going right after a long time of going wrong. It was not an elaborate wedding. She would not have wanted it to be. There was a judge from town and the 6 ranch hands. Pete had stayed, Wyatt's old space filled in, and Clara Whitfield, who had apparently decided she was invited and arrived with a jar of preserved plums and the expression of a woman who had seen this coming longer than anyone would give her credit for. Lillian wore her good dress and had her braids done properly, which Rosalie had done herself that morning, while the girl sat still, with the particular patience she only deployed for things that mattered to her. Henry Cole was Caleb's witness. He signed with the same blunt practicality. He'd signed the wage ledger, and when he handed the pen back, he said, "Good," in exactly the same tone he'd used then, as if both occasions were simply things that should have happened and now had. After it was done, and the judge had gone, and the afternoon was warm, Rosalie stood on the porch for a moment by herself. Not for long. She could hear Lillian in the kitchen starting something without having been asked, which was going to require supervision, and Clara was explaining something at length to Mateo, who appeared to be listening with extreme patience, and Caleb was talking with Henry near the barn, and Eli was laughing at something Marcus had said, and the whole ranch was making its ordinary sounds around her. She looked at the kitchen garden, at the apple tree with its green fruit coming in, at the scorched earth where the cookhouse had been, which had mostly grown over by now, some volunteer grass, and a small determined plant she hadn't been able to identify that had decided to grow there regardless. She thought about what it cost, to be the kind of person who walked through open gates. She thought about the woman in September who had dragged a trunk 2 miles in the cold on $11 and no certainty, and who had stood at a gate and looked at a broken ranch and decided, for reasons she couldn't have fully articulated then and could only partially articulate now, to stay. She had not been rescued. She had not arrived to save anyone. She had arrived as a person who knew how to work and kept her own records and was patient for reasons that were strategic, not soft. And she had met people who were imperfect in their own ways, who had failed her in their own ways. In the way of a man who waited 3 days to tell her important news, and the way of a man who said a cheap thing he thought she hadn't heard, and the way of a household that had let her work for 11 weeks without putting a number to what that work was worth. She had stayed anyway. Not because she was saintly about it, not because she didn't see the failures clearly. She saw them as clearly as she saw anything, which was very clearly. She stayed because she had looked at the whole picture, the failures and the apple butter day and the notebook and the gate that swung open. And she'd decided that the whole picture was worth staying for. That was the thing nobody told you about belonging somewhere. It wasn't a feeling that arrived and stayed. It was a decision you made, and then made again, and then made again, and the accumulation of those decisions was what became a home. She had made the decision enough times now that it was just where she lived. She heard Lillian from the kitchen, unmistakably doing something that needed watching. She went inside. The kitchen was warm. It was always warm now, which was different from the kitchen she'd walked into in September, the one that held grief-like furniture. That kitchen still existed in the bones of this one, but it was not what the room was anymore. The room was what you did in it, and what you said in it, and who stayed in it when the weather was bad and the numbers were wrong, and there was still, always, a meal to make. She looked at what Lillian had pulled out of the pantry with the focused intent of someone who had decided without consultation to start a project. "What are you making?" Rosalie asked. Lillian looked up. "I wanted to make the yellow cake, the one Mama made." She hesitated just slightly. "I don't know the recipe." Rosalie looked at her. She thought about the recipe book wrapped in oilcloth on the shelf above the housekeeper's bed. Her room now, their room now, eventually. And she thought about her mother's dense practical handwriting. She didn't have Margaret Barrow's yellow cake recipe, but she had her own mother's, which was close, and she knew how to adjust. "I know one," she said. "Come here, I'll show you." Lillian came to stand beside her at the counter. They made the cake. It wasn't Margaret's recipe. It was Rosalie's mother's, adapted on the spot, with Lillian measuring the flour with more confidence than accuracy, and Rosalie correcting quietly without making it a lesson. And the kitchen smelled like butter and sugar and the particular warmth of something being made from scratch by two people who were learning how to be a family, which was not so different, when you looked at it honestly, from learning to cook anything. You started with what you had, you made adjustments as you went. You didn't wait until everything was perfect to put the thing in the oven. By the time Caleb came in from the barn, the cake was done. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it cooling on the rack and at his daughter with flour on her dress and at Rosalie standing beside her, and he said nothing for a moment. "Yellow cake," Lillian said. "I can see that." He came in and sat at his table. It was fully his table again, in the way that things could be both yours and shared at once. "What's the occasion?" "Today," Lillian said simply. He looked at Rosalie. She looked back at him. Something moved between them that was quiet and did not need a name. "Today's a good occasion," he said. She cut 3 pieces and put them on the table and sat down. Outside, the June afternoon was doing what June afternoons did in Wyoming. Big sky, long light, the smell of things growing. The ranch was making its sounds. The kitchen was warm. She ate her cake. It wasn't her mother's exactly. It wasn't Margaret Barrow's either. It was something new, made in a kitchen that had been someone else's and was now also hers, by hands that had built something out of nothing and intended to keep building. That was the whole of it. That was what she'd learned, or maybe what she'd always known and had finally found the right circumstances to practice. That you didn't wait to belong somewhere until you were certain you were wanted. You showed up, you did the work, you kept your records, you stayed when staying was hard, and you made your conditions known, and you held your own hand out when the situation required it, and you let people take it. And over time, if you were paying attention, and if they were decent, that became a life. It wasn't a perfect life. It was better than that. It was a real one.